Hi everyone. Good to see you on my channel today. Today I will tell you a wonderful story. It is full of love and kindness. I hope you enjoy it and I wish you an enjoyable viewing experience. Thank you.
Anthony was returning home from important negotiations. His business class car was driving confidently along the road. Meanwhile, the businessman was looking out the window and thinking about the events of the past day. The deal with foreign partners, on which he had so counted on, had almost failed. The French partners had decided at the last minute to drastically change the terms. The French partners decided at the last minute to abruptly change the terms of the agreement between them and demanded a percentage of profits twice the amount they had originally agreed on. Anthony had barely managed to settle the matter, and in fact he had just bought himself a little more time before he would actually have to give a final answer. Anthony stood at the traffic lights and involuntarily rubbed his face with his hands, as if he was trying to shake off all his worries and anxiety about the future of the company. To think about it, he was only 28, and he was already the head of a large media empire which had several branches in America and already 4 in other countries. Naturally, foreign partners immediately became active, wanting to get a bigger share in such a profitable enterprise. So Anthony had to spend all his time at work, trying to put things in order. The most frustrating thing is that the young man did not even have a lover to be able to distract from all the complexities of the work process on love and the joy of relationships. It turned out so not because Anthony was betrayed by someone or he experienced a painful parting. No, the young businessman just did not want to enter into, as he himself put it, an empty relationship. The fact is that Anthony by nature has always been a very deep and loyal person, and he expected the same from his future mate. But it was not easy to meet such a girl, and he did not want to settle for less. And to tell the truth, Anthony now was not to love and romance. The business, recently given to him by his parents, had become a serious responsibility. He had to orientate himself literally on the fly, although his father tried to pass him the key parameters of the family business. However, as soon as Anthony took on the job himself, he immediately realized that the company needed a global overhaul. Much of what Mr. William practiced in his business has simply become outdated and required a complete revision of the basic concept of management. And the conduct of all internal processes of the firm parents meanwhile constantly pressed Anthony, especially his mother, Mrs. Annie. She certainly wanted to marry her son in the near future, and to a girl from some very famous and high-ranking family. "Anthony, darling, are you sure you don't want to come with us to the golf club this weekend?" Mrs. Annie asked meaningfully. "The Cooper couple and their daughter will be there. Chloe's back from London this year." Yes, imagine that, she finished her undergraduate degree there. "Now the girl's a Master of Arts. Sounds like a great fit for you. You should definitely take a look at her." "There you go again." Anthony sighed heavily. "I thought I made it clear to you and Dad that I'm not interested in a relationship just yet. And I certainly don't want to consider all sorts of options. You know I'm going to marry like a normal person, for love, and to someone of my own choosing." "Anthony, son," Mum retorted indignantly, "by the time you choose a wife, your father and I will be old enough. You're nearly 30, aren't you? It's time to start thinking about starting a family and having a home of your own. I realize you don't have much time. You're busy with the company, but we want to make it easy for you. Trust me, you can rely on your mum. I'll pick you a girl from the best family." "Mom." I said no. Anthony exclaimed, feeling irritation coming on. "You don't need to get involved in arranging my life. I can handle it just fine on my own." "I see," Mrs. Annie said dryly. "Do you want to leave us without heirs, to act like the ultimate selfish man? What if something suddenly happens to you?" The woman began to sob, tears welling up in her eyes. "If you get into an accident like your naughty brother and leave Daddy and me, do you think we can survive that? Do you think I can?" Mrs. Annie began to sob loudly, and poor Anthony had to comfort her, apologizing for his intemperance. "Mum, please calm down. Please don't worry so much about me. I was unforgivably rude to you. I apologize. It's just that you know how hard it is for me to work at Dad's company." "This was all John's job to handle," Anthony said. "Yeah, but he's gone," the woman said through tears. "Now you, Anthony, are our last hope. I won't survive the death of another son. And of course I want you to have children, and I want Papa and me to have grandchildren, so that the stomping of little children's feet can be heard in our house again." Anthony held his mother tightly to him then, and could hardly comfort her. John was 2 years older than him, and had been preparing since he was a boy to lead his father's empire. Anthony had always admired the hard work and perseverance his brother put in to become a worthy leader. He studied very hard, constantly taking additional courses to learn skills that could be useful to him in business. But all this lasted exactly until John began to drink. It happened about a year ago. The older brother abruptly lost interest in everything, burned out and as if he didn't know where to put himself. When questioned by his parents, John every time answered evasively, saying that the vector of his interest in life had changed. But in what direction he changed, he did not specify. Instead, his brother closed himself in their home library with a bottle of whiskey and stayed there for hours, consuming one glass of alcohol after another. Anthony still held himself responsible for his brother's death. Maybe if they had sounded the alarm sooner, if they had thought about how to help him sooner, John would be alive now. Anthony instead tried to stay away from his brother, thinking that he was having an identity crisis and that John was old enough and self-sufficient enough to handle it on his own. As a result, his older brother just got behind the wheel drunk one day and crashed at breakneck speed into a train passing by on the railway. The investigation found that it wasn't a suicide. He simply fell asleep at the wheel because of the huge amount of alcohol drunk before the trip. Except that Anthony himself took this tragedy as a real sign from above. He sincerely believed that his brother was thus trying to ask him and his parents for help, but none of them heard him. Both he and his mother and father experienced this loss with great difficulty. Anthony even underwent several courses of psychotherapy, so difficult it was for him to cope with the pain tearing him from the inside. The young businessman could not come to terms with such a stupid and terrible death of his brother, so he admitted to himself that he also needed help and went to a specialist. John had been gone for 7 months. The subject of his death was still very painful for Anthony. The young man often came to the cemetery to his brother's grave and had long conversations with him, asking forgiveness for his then frivolity and unwillingness to see the problems. So when his mother, without realizing it, began to manipulate and pressure him through the image of his deceased brother, Anthony found it very difficult to contain his resentment and anger. He was already under a lot of pressure from his father, who controlled his every move. And then there was Mum and her marriage. That was partly why he had plunged into the business so eagerly, taking it entirely on his shoulders. When John was alive, Anthony did not think of becoming the head of his father's company. The guy dreamed of linking his life with art. The current businessman planned to open his own art gallery in the city and exhibit their young and promising artists, whose talent in the future could decorate the living room or hallway of the house of a famous person. Mrs. Annie and Mr. William often laughed at their youngest son on account of this. "Oh, Anthony, you're not like us in that respect," his father used to say to him. "You had better take a better example from your brother. He, John, is already running the branch proper. He's getting into our business thoroughly, so to speak. And you're all about the pictures. So maybe it's for the best," objected the son with a smile. "We already have one brother who is a businessman in our family. Let there be another brother, a gallerist known throughout the city. I'm not drawn, Papa, to all this business stuff of yours." "Oh, you shouldn't say that, son," answered the mother in Mr. William's stead. "We live in a world now where you can't live without a reliable business. What are you going to do with those paintings if nobody buys them? You could have used your skills more effectively at your father's firm. Did we pay all that money for your training for nothing?" Anthony clenched his teeth and said nothing. He couldn't explain to his mother his attraction to painting rather than to documents and endless financial reports. One way or another, he had to take over from John. And now he was learning the basics of management at a rapid pace every day, using his creative skills for the good of the family business. He would never get John back, no matter how hurt and offended Anthony and his parents were. As for getting married, he made it clear to his father and mother that he would not be in a hurry. When the time comes, I will meet my true love, the girl I want to tie my life to. Anthony told his parents. You will certainly be the first to know. He was still sitting behind the wheel of his car, looking out at the summer sun setting over the horizon. A warm breeze blew in through the open window, which brought the young man out of his reverie. The businessman was just passing over a wide motorway bridge that sprawled over a small river when he saw something strange. It seemed to Anthony that there was someone in the water, because the water surface was somehow unnaturally rising and falling. Looking around, he noted that none of the motorists were stopping. Anthony pulled over to the side of the road and walked out to the bridge railing. Taking a closer look, the young businessman realized he wasn't mistaken. There was a young girl in the water, a few meters below him, desperately fighting the current. Damn it! Anthony cursed to himself, and without thinking long enough, he threw off his shoes and jacket, and then dived after the unfortunate girl into the deepest part of the river. The water was murky, but the man quickly found the stranger going down. Taking her under the armpits with one hand, Anthony began to row desperately to bring the drowning woman to the surface. The latter was not easy, for the current that the girl was trying to overcome was indeed so strong that it almost carried the businessman in the opposite direction. Anthony almost lost his orientation himself, but as he had trained a lot in the swim team at school, he was still able to cope with the water element and save her. When they managed to get ashore with great difficulty, the girl recovered a little and looked at her savior with gratitude. She slowly rose to her feet. Her clothes were soaked through, but she still managed to give the businessman a weak smile. "Thank you," she stammered out. "If it weren't for you, Bax and I would be completely lost." The businessman, who was trying to catch his breath at this time, looked with mute amazement at the girl. "With what, Bax?" he asked in an incomprehensible tone. Anthony thought at first that the poor fellow was a little lost from stress, but at that moment he noticed the girl clasping her hands to her chest. Only now, in the middle of the sandy bank under the bridge, there was a quiet and pitiful whimpering, and Anthony saw in the stranger's hands a tiny, 1-month-old puppy. "Is that what you went into the water for?" Anthony exclaimed with undisguised indignation. "Did you jump in after the puppy?" "Well, yes," nodded the girl, shivering with cold. "Some rascal threw him right in front of me into the water. Just took it out of my bag like that." The memory caused her to burst into another fit of tears. It was only then that Anthony noticed the girl's rounded belly protruding strongly from beneath her wet clothes. She was pregnant, and the term seemed to be quite advanced. "No. Are you out of your mind at all?" shouted the businessman at her, shocked. "Are you sick of living? What if all 3 of you had drowned? Okay, you don't think about yourself, but what's your child got to do with it?" The unfortunate woman modestly lowered her large light blue eyes and continued to hold and stroke the whimpering puppy. She herself was as pale as the first snow. When Anthony saw the girl's lips begin to turn blue, he realized that she was on the edge. It was impossible to get anything out of her in such a state, so Anthony decided to take her to his cottage so that she could warm up and come to her senses. "What's your name anyway?" Beatrice Morris," she answered, exactly as she had done in school. "All right, Beatrice," Anthony interrupted her, sighing. "Why don't you get in my car and I'll take you back to my place. I'll give you a hot cup of tea. You rest there and we'll see what you need to do next." She nodded briefly and got into the car. The puppy, of course, was still with her. Anthony shook his head, slammed the door behind him, and turned on the heater so she could dry off. Even though it was summer, but after the water and even pregnant, extra warmth would not hurt. The cottage where he was going to take Beatrice had once been their family home, but in the last couple of years only John had been going there. The young man explained to his younger brother that he went to the countryside to gain strength and relax from the hustle and bustle of the city. John could live at the cottage for weeks and then come rested and fresh to plunge into the affairs of his father's firm with renewed vigor. However, before his death, his brother was not interested in even that. After John's departure, the cottage passed to Anthony, and he sometimes went there in memory of his brother. Mother and father could not bring themselves to go there. They had too many memories of the place in John's childhood. Besides, Anthony understood perfectly well he could not bring Beatrice to his home. Her parents simply wouldn't understand. A poorly dressed girl soaking wet, clutching a street puppy, and 8 months pregnant. It's not hard to imagine what thoughts would immediately pop into their heads. Anthony and Beatrice barely spoke a word during the whole journey. Beatrice was mostly silent and demure. Anthony kept his eyes on the road as it began to darken rapidly. Out of the corner of his eye, he glanced at the girl from time to time. Beautiful, fragile, with a mop of fluffy light brown hair. Beatrice could have been a true lady if it weren't for her poor clothes, obviously second-hand, and her noticeable thinness. They gave Beatrice away. If not a rich girl, then certainly not an ordinary one. Beatrice, as the businessman realized from their brief conversation, had been brought up in an orphanage and had been left to fend for herself for most of her own life. She had no relatives, and when asked if she had a husband or fiancé, she would not answer at all. "I'm not comfortable with the subject. I'm sorry," she explained to Anthony. The man did not insist and left the girl alone. When they reached the cottage, something strange happened. At the sight of John's house, Beatrice looked at Anthony with surprise, but did not say anything aloud. The businessman thought that she had never seen such large country houses, so he just nodded, trying to fumble in his pocket for the keys to the front door. "What the hell?" he muttered to himself, patting himself in all his pockets. "Where could I have put it?" "Have you lost something?" inquired the girl politely. "Yes. I lost the key. I guess when I was diving into the river after you." Anthony remembered exactly that he had the key in the breast pocket of his shirt. He always carried it there in case he needed to stop by the cottage. Finally, he shook his head dejectedly. "It can't be helped. I guess I'll have to climb through the window after all." Beatrice watched her rescuer closely, but when he was about to kick out the small window on the ground floor leading into the storeroom, the girl stopped the businessman. "Anthony, you needn't. Let me better open it with my key." Then Beatrice put the puppy on the opposite shoulder. He only squeaked in his sleep and pulled out of her pocket a thin cord, on which was exactly the same key as the owner of the house. It was not a duplicate or a hastily made fake. Anthony could have sworn that the key was a genuine one. Beatrice turned it in the keyhole exactly 3 times, and then there was a distinctive click, and the door opened. "What is this?" Anthony recoiled from her in shock. "Where did you get that key from?" Beatrice looked at him completely calmly, then uttered, "Anthony, you just don't worry. Let us have tea with you and I'll tell you all about it." "I should like that very much," he replied gravely. Half an hour later, when the young people had brewed hot, fragrant herbal tea in their mugs, Beatrice confided, "Anthony, the thing is, I was John's fiancée before he died." "What?" The man couldn't contain his emotions. "How so? Why haven't we heard anything about you then?" The girl only grinned bitterly. "I was as poor as a church mouse. Can't you tell from me?" John was afraid of the family's reaction, yours and your parents. He said you were very protective of your reputation in the community. Who wants a daughter-in-law who lives virtually below the poverty line? It took Anthony a few seconds to realize what he had heard. Wait a minute. How did you meet him?" he asked. "John met me by chance and saved me," the girl explained, sighing. "I was standing outside the metro then, begging for alms, because nobody wanted to hire me. I couldn't even get a job as a cleaner." Beatrice stroked her backs, whom they had thoughtfully bought a carton of milk. The puppy was now sleeping peacefully on the mat, having drunk plenty of it. "Some majors started harassing me. They wanted to take me away in their car somewhere. Obviously, when you have money, breaking the law is no problem." Beatrice's hands trembled at the memory of that day. And then John showed up. He ran out of nowhere and dispersed those bastards. That's how we met. We met at my flat. We loved each other very much. "And how long were you two together?" Anthony asked in amazement. "Almost a year," she replied, looking him straight in the eye. From that look, Anthony realized that Beatrice was not lying. She really was his brother's fiancée. So much for saving the girl with the puppy. "John wanted to marry me, but he was afraid to tell my father about me. He thought he would disinherit him out of anger, Beatrice explained confusedly. At that moment, Anthony noticed how much she began to worry and clasped her own fingers. "Calm down, please," Anthony asked her quietly and covered her hand with his. "Tell me, did you know about my brother's addiction to alcohol?" Beatrice endured a long, questioning look from the businessman, after which tears glistened in her eyes. "Yes, but I really tried to stop him," the girl uttered, weeping. "He started drinking when I got pregnant. I couldn't think of a way to bring me to his house and introduce me to you. Because of that, basically, I'm the reason he died." Beatrice could not bear it and burst into tears, covering her face with her hands. "You can't blame yourself for his death." Anthony tried to soothe her. "No one is to blame for what happened to my brother. It just took me a long time to realize what happened to him, why he suddenly started drinking." The young businessman looked at his guest carefully. "But now I realize John was just ashamed of us. He was ashamed of us in front of you. My parents, and I guess I'm part snob. And my brother didn't want you to have to deal with that unnecessarily. Didn't want to hurt you and your child." Anthony leaned back in his chair in amazement. It finally made sense to him. The situation was clearer, but one thing the young man still couldn't understand. "Why didn't you come to us when John was gone? You must have needed help. And I understand money has been tight since your brother's death." Through sobs, Beatrice replied, "Well, what do you think? Look at me. I'm telling you I'm a beggar and I have a belly. How can you imagine it? Could I have come to your house and told you that John was almost my husband, that we wanted to get married? You'd have me thrown out of the door." Beatrice silently pointed to the key of the cottage. "John used to bring me here. He wanted to be outdoors with me. That's when he gave me this key. Said I could come here anytime I wanted. But of course I never came here when he wasn't around. I kept the key for some reason, probably in memory of him. I put it on my shoelace and now I wear it instead of a talisman." The girl gently stroked the key and smiled weakly. "Wow, who would have thought it could still come in handy?" Anthony was at a complete loss. Surely this girl could not be left in trouble, especially as she carried his own nephew under her heart. "Beatrice, listen," began the businessman. "Stay here to live for the time being. I will bring you and the baby all the necessary food, vitamins. Just don't go anywhere, please." Beatrice looked at him questioningly. "You won't bother anyone here," Anthony assured her. "I won't say anything to my parents just yet. They're not coming here themselves. You're right, I do need to think about how to break the news to them. But I want you to stay here until I can figure out how to bring you into the family. I'm sure they'll be happy to know they're about to have a grandchild. After all, they dream of him so much." Beatrice looked at him, and from the expression in her eyes, the man realized that she did not have much faith in the success of the undertaking. Yet the girl agreed. What was she to do? Not go back outside under the open sky. "All right," she said at last. "I'll try to be quiet so the neighbors won't suspect anything." After that, she cooked her and Anthony an unpretentious dinner, and then the businessman drove back. From that moment, Anthony began to take care of Beatrice, coming to the cottage often and for a short time. He brought food, vitamins and fruit for the baby, and of course, food and treats for little Bax, whom Beatrice almost never let out of her hands. The most interesting thing is that the young businessman was not at all embarrassed by the girl's poverty. He felt that from her emanated inner energy and beauty. Anthony was amazed at her resilience and optimism. After all, Beatrice to the last waited and tolerated the indecision of his late brother in the hope that he still dared to go against the will of his parents and make Beatrice his lawful wife. Surprisingly, Anthony was comfortable around this brave girl. When he asked her age, he was greatly surprised to learn that Beatrice was only 23 years old. John was much older and therefore had to take full responsibility, except that for some reason he was never able to see it through. As it turned out, the older brother of the businessman was a determined and confident man only at work, but in his personal life became a victim of his own prejudices, no matter how sad it was to realize it, Anthony. At the same time, Mrs. Annie and Mr. William began to suspect that something wrong was going on with their son. More than anything, they feared that the same thing would happen to Anthony that had happened to his older brother. So they decided to find out as a matter of urgency what the younger one was hiding at their old cottage. What if he's drinking there too, like John? Or worse, Mrs. Annie sobbed. It doesn't look like it, shook his head Mr. William. Besides, Anthony wouldn't behave like that. He's even consulted a psychologist on the subject. He hasn't been able to stand the spirit of alcohol since his brother's death. There's no telling what might be the matter, exclaimed the wife. He doesn't drink today, and tomorrow John used to go there just the same. And what? No, let's go. My heart tells me we're in for a nasty surprise. That's said and done. Having once again followed their son, the parents went to the cottage at the moment when Anthony had already left Beatrice and the puppy. Upon reaching the place, the rich people witnessed a very strange and incomprehensible for them picture. A pregnant girl, very similar to a beggar, sat on the porch and chewed an apple. In addition, there was a flea-ridden puppy at her feet. Very interesting. Speaking from the shadows, Mrs. Annie said, And what on earth are we doing here? In someone else's house? And Anthony's mother's voice was quiet, but it was the calm before the storm. With each successive word, the thunder in her intonation grew higher and higher, and threatened to become a shriek. Why is some beggar sleeping in my house? Who gave you the keys? Confess at once, you sly creature. Mrs. Annie's eyes blazed with righteous anger, and here not even Mr. William could stop her. You've got it all wrong, Beatrice tried to explain the situation to them. Anthony has given me permission to live here. I am pregnant by your eldest son, John. Beatrice's voice trembled, but she found the strength to tell the truth as it was. However, Mrs. Annie's face contorted into a grimace of terrible anger. What? What dare you say, you bitch? How dare you bring my boy into your fornication? John would never get mixed up with a pauper like you. You have no conscience. Annie, what are you getting so excited about? The old businessman tried to placate his wife. Young lady, you must really be better off leaving this house. The man looked expressively at Beatrice. Get out, you shameless girl, shrieked, as if exploding, Anthony's mother. Her exhortations were at that moment utterly uninteresting. Why do you do that, Mrs. Annie? Beatrice asked reproachfully. I did love your son. I miss him very much, just as much as you do. Out, shouted Mrs. Annie with all her might, so that the common people in the neighboring houses willy-nilly woke up and turned on the lights. Scandals were rare in their sleepy village, and at the country house of such rich people as the Harrisons. Crying with humiliation and resentment, Beatrice quickly gathered up her modest belongings, took Bax with her, and ran down the porch steps, disappearing into the darkness of the summer night. This was not the attitude she had expected to receive. So her dear John was right. He did have incredibly prejudiced parents. Perhaps we were wrong to be so cruel to the girl. Mr. William tried to intercede for Beatrice. Are you going to say anything more in her defense? Her spouse looked at him menacingly. The elderly businessman faltered and silently drove his wife back home. There they were met by an agitated Anthony, who had been fumbling with his phone for the third hour trying to reach his parents. Mom, Dad, where have you been? I've already lost you. His son looked at them perplexed as they took off their shoes in the hallway. Yes, son. I confess you disappoint me after all. The mother began slowly. We've been to your cottage, the one you inherited from John. Anthony turned pale. He knew at once that his mother had found out about everything. Ah, I see you know you've got some beggar woman and her dog living there, Mrs. Annie shrieked, and began to step slowly towards her son. What have you done with Beatrice, Mum? Anthony asked coldly. What I had to do, I did. Kicked her out, replied his mother with a proud upturned chin. Are you mad? Anthony couldn't take it anymore. She's in the last months of pregnancy. She could give birth at any moment. The young businessman began to argue with his mother, proving that this girl had everything to do with their family. However, Mrs. Annie only laughed in response. Who are you listening to, son? Wake up. People like her would cheat anyone for a place to live and a piece of bread in the capital. Do you really think she could have been your brother's fiancée? She had a key to the house, Mum, the son explained to them, barely containing his anger. And yes, I believe her. We talked to her a lot about her brother. Mrs. Annie squinted thinly, as if facing an attack. You just don't understand anything, she hissed. How do we know now that it is our John's child she is carrying under her heart? That girl could have been loved by anyone. And now I'm supposed to feed her and support her until she gives birth. Of course, when the baby's born, we can do a DNA test, but it's a long way off. In any case, I'm not going to go along with this liar. With these words, Mrs. Annie went to her room, and her father rushed after her, worried that his beloved wife's blood pressure might not spike. Anthony remained standing in the drawing room, tormented by feelings of embarrassment and guilt. He realized that Beatrice was telling the truth, and that his parents had thrown an innocent girl out on the street just before she gave birth. He tried to find his late brother's fiancée, but it was in vain. Beatrice seemed to disappear and did not answer the phone calls, which Anthony never tired to make in an attempt to get through to her. He had bought her a simple push-button phone so that he could always be in touch if she needed anything. But it had been over a fortnight and Beatrice still hadn't returned a single phone call. Anthony became worried when he remembered that she was about to give birth. After calling several maternity hospitals, the young businessman found the one where Beatrice was lying and hurried there at once. In the waiting room, Anthony called himself her fiancé in front of the doctors, all in order to get to her room. I warn you, she's very weak right now, the doctor told him. Your bride's fetus was very large. The woman in labor herself, on the other hand, is of rather frail build. Her pelvis is very narrow, so we had to do a cesarean. Beatrice lost a lot of blood, but luckily she and the baby are out of danger now. At these words, Anthony felt immediately relieved. Thanking the doctor, the businessman went to Beatrice. She was lying on the bed, very pale, paler than in their first meeting with Anthony. However, at the sight of the visitor, the girl smiled. I didn't think I'd see you again. Anthony, her voice was very low and weak, but the lad could still hear everything well. He immediately jumped up to her. I'm sorry about my mom and dad, Beatrice. I'm so sorry they kicked you out. She shook her head slowly. You don't have to be. I mean, I understand it all. In their eyes, I'm a predatory con artist who wants a rich suitor by any means necessary. It's hard for them to believe John and I have feelings for each other. They shouldn't have kicked you out, Anthony said, taking her gently by the arm. I still can't get it into my head how they could have done that to you. Just then he felt the girl weakly squeeze his palm in return. Thank you, Anthony, for your support and for everything in general. She gave the young businessman a long look, and at that moment he realized that he himself was ready to drown in those sky-blue eyes. Realizing that there was almost no one to take care of the child while his mother was recovering from a serious operation, Anthony tried to visit Beatrice more often. He hoped that she would recover faster if she felt care and warmth of heart. He carried to the maternity hospital everything necessary for the young mother and her baby. Food, nappies, medicines necessary for Beatrice and her nephew. Anthony did not spare any money, only if Alex, as the boy was named, and his mother would come back to normal faster. One day Anthony was summoned by the attending physician. From his concentrated face, the young businessman realized something unpleasant had happened. Alex has a heart defect. The surgeon began at once. The situation is extremely grave. If the infant is not operated on, he will not have long to live. Anthony was in shock. Is there nothing that can be done? And when do we have to do this operation? With all his strength, he asked. 6 months at the latest. We can't delay here in any case, replied the doctor. Any delay may cost your boy's life. Another thing is that the queue for free surgery may stretch for several months or even a year. But aren't newborns given a quota out of turn? Anthony looked at him doubtfully. They do, nodded the serious surgeon. But do you have any idea how many of these babies we have all over the country? Anyway, if I were you, I'd start preparing for the fact that you'll have to pay for the operation. The doctor voiced the amount needed for the surgery and subsequent rehabilitation of the baby. Without delay, Anthony agreed to pay for everything. If you need any help from me, I'm ready to do anything, the businessman fervently assured him. The surgeon suggested Anthony take compatibility tests as the uncle wanted to be a donor to the baby. But when a blood draw was done on little Alex, the unbelievable was revealed. The fact was that absolutely no blood relation was found between Beatrice and Anthony's son. "So you mean to say that this boy is not related to me?" Anthony asked the lab technician in amazement. "Unfortunately, that is indeed so," replied the latter, and lowered his eyes. "You have nothing in common with him." The businessman didn't know what to think. He didn't talk to Beatrice about anything. He just didn't understand how he should communicate with her now, after everything that had happened. What if his parents were right, and he had taken in a common rogue? And what to do with the feelings for Beatrice, which he was not at all ready to give up? "I guess you were right," Anthony said to his mother. "It was Beatrice who fattened her child somewhere, and then decided to fool our John with it." Anthony was ready to weep himself at such a betrayal. "Is my brother dead because of her? But I feel sorry for her baby. That's what hurts." On learning that Beatrice's son had been diagnosed with a serious heart defect, Anthony's mother suddenly softened. She looked warily at Mr. William, who only nodded silently. "You see, son, here's the thing," Mrs. Annie began in a trembling voice. "I suppose we should have told you everything a long time ago, but we kept lacking the resolve." "What is it?" Anthony shifted his gaze anxiously from her to his father and back again. "The fact is," said his mother slowly, "that you don't know everything about your brother." Anthony felt his heart beat twice as fast. "Mom?" He looked at her questioningly. Just then Mr. William, who took pity on his spouse, entered the conversation. "What Mama means to say, Anthony, is that John, though he was a son to us, was not related by blood." "How do you mean?" Stammering, the young businessman interrogated them. "William and I have been unable to conceive for a very long time," Mrs. Annie said, wiping her eyes with her handkerchief, embarrassed. "So we decided to take a baby from the orphanage. We picked out the one we thought looked the most like me and Daddy and brought him up. We loved John like he was our own. I swear." The mother clasped her hands to her chest. "And then 2 years later we had you. But we never felt any difference between you," Father hastened to add. "You were both loved by me and Annie quite alike. Now you know the whole truth." Anthony felt that the air in the room where they were sitting had suddenly come to an abrupt end. He had nothing to say to that, except to wonder how they could have kept the fact that John was their adopted son from him for so many years. "That's what John himself asked for," Mr. William explained to Anthony. "He didn't want you to see him as an outsider in the family. You were teenagers then, and he felt strongly about it." "I don't believe my ears," said the son. "Yes, I adored him, always admired him, and I could have cared less whether he was my own or not." Anthony felt his heart pounding with indignation. "Mom, Dad, I understand, but I've always loved my brother, and that will never change." Anthony finally said, "You should have told me everything at once. All these prejudices of yours, look where they've brought us all." Anthony wasn't angry with his parents. He realized that they were not worried about Beatrice's son, because they knew perfectly well that this grandson was not their own. However, everything changed the moment Mrs. Annie found out that the baby was ill. Now that Anthony knew the truth, he could no longer worry about Beatrice's loyalty to his brother. After paying for the boy's operation, he continued to care for him and Beatrice. When the young mother was discharged from the hospital, Anthony immediately took her to his and his parents' mansion. There Beatrice could take care of the baby in peace. And Anthony himself and Mrs. Annie, tawed towards the little grandchild, began to actively help her. The funniest thing was that Bax, whom Beatrice, as it turned out, had given to one of her good friends, who lived in a small house on the outskirts of the city, before giving birth, moved to the mansion. Bax now had his own beautiful doghouse where he loved to hide and sleep, after playing rough with Anthony. Alex underwent surgery just a couple of months later, when the boy was strong enough for such manipulations to be performed on his heart. Beatrice was very worried about her son, but luckily the surgery was a success. And now Alex is a healthy baby boy like all other children. All this time their first tender feelings were slowly developing between Beatrice and Anthony. Beatrice herself did not understand why this tall, blonde-haired man was causing her such excitement. Anthony was nothing like John. And yet, From the moment he had saved his life, the young mother felt that she was gradually falling in love with Harrison's youngest son. Anthony, on the other hand, was simply enjoying Beatrice's company, not hoping for more, although strong feelings were also raging in his heart. For the first time, he realized that Beatrice was the one with whom he wanted to tie his life. It took several more months before Anthony decided to ask Beatrice out on their first real date. The man was very nervous and generally acted like a boy in love, not knowing where best to ask her out. "Beatrice, let's go to the cinema," he suggested. "Gosh, it must be ages since I've been there," Beatrice replied, laughing happily, and gratefully accepted the bouquet of beautiful white roses Anthony had prepared for her. "If you like it, I promise we'll go there every week," he assured her fervently. The date went off just fine, and at the end of the evening, the young people did not hold back their feelings and finally joined in a tender and passionate kiss. Both had been waiting for this for too long, so they decided that they would no longer put their lives on hold, but would start loving and feeling again here and now. Another 6 months later, they had a beautiful, lavish wedding. Little Alex, sitting in his grandmother's arms, admired his beautiful mum, who seemed the happiest woman in the world that day. Anthony had never seen Beatrice so radiant and healthy. By that time, she had grown stronger and transformed herself from a poor haggard girl to a charming and slender lady. Beatrice easily coped with the role of mistress of the house, and at social gatherings, where she sometimes had to go with her husband. She looked and behaved so dignified that Anthony's parents were involuntarily proud of her. The latter circumstance was only strengthened when a strange event occurred a year later. It happened on Christmas Eve. Beatrice received a very unusual letter in which a certain couple Bleck asked her for a personal meeting. Beatrice knew that she had a lot of competitors in the business, and to go to unknown people alone could be very imprudent and dangerous. After telling her husband all about it, she asked him to go to the meeting with her. "Sure, we'll go to see them that same weekend," her husband calmly agreed. When they arrived at the most fashionable hotel in the city, they were met in the lobby and escorted to a deluxe room. There, a handsome older couple was already waiting for Beatrice and her husband. They greeted her with hugs and tears and immediately told her who she really was. "How can it be that you are my mom and dad?" Looking at them perplexed, the woman asked, "I grew up in an orphanage, and I don't remember anything at all until I was 5 years old." The elderly lady, whose name was Mrs. Sherrill, merely wiped tears from the corners of her eyes. "That's the thing, sweetheart. You lived with us until you were 3, she said, shaking her head. "We were the happiest family. We had such a wonderful business." And then they decided, Beatrice's father, Mr. Harry, added, "They tried to take away your business." Anthony asked concernedly. "That's right," replied the elderly businessman. "We owned a large jewelry factory. Among other things, we were in the business of making amber jewelry. You see, amber was truly a deadly stone at that time. Any business where it appeared automatically became dangerous. Unfortunately, we were so naive and thought as if we wouldn't be affected," the businesswoman continued. "We thought that the law would be on our side, that we would be protected. But in the end, we had to defend ourselves against the law," Mr. Harry finished for his wife with a bitter smile. "We had to flee, but it was very dangerous if we took Beatrice with us. So we decided to leave you here, entrusting you to Nanny. We didn't realize we would have to hide for so long." Beatrice looked at her parents sorrowfully. "Then why didn't you take me away?" "We couldn't find you," exclaimed her mother. "Nanny herself had to hide for a long time. The criminals tried in every possible way to get on her trail to take you away. They wanted to blackmail us with you," continued Mr. Harry. "That poor woman found no better way out than to give you to an orphanage," her husband finished with bitterness in his voice. "Your tracks were lost. And not only the bandits couldn't find you, but neither could we," Mrs. Sherrill said, touching her daughter's face with tenderness. "But now, if you'll let us, we'll at least observe your life from afar. After all, we only found out you were alive because of your wedding," she added. "When we saw your photos, we immediately realized it's you. The happy girl in the photo is our daughter. You're a carbon copy of me when you were young." Beatrice looked at her parents with love and understanding. "You don't need to watch me from afar. I want us to always be close to each other now, Beatrice pronounced. I have missed so many happy years without you, and now I intend to make up for it. They embraced, and all four, including Anthony, shed many tears. Happiness. As it turned out later, Beatrice is the sole heiress of a huge and very rich jewelry house. The spouses of Bleck were able to keep a part of their business and now wanted to involve their only daughter in it. Beatrice, of course, agreed to become part of the business. But first she had to get the necessary education. Mrs. Annie, upon learning who her daughter-in-law really was delighted and assured her that she would help her with the baby while Beatrice received her training. After all, as it turned out, she and Anthony were of the same status, which meant that their family not only lost nothing, but gained a valuable asset in the form of Beatrice and her jewelry empire. God, if I had known my daughter had parents like that, I would never have said a word against her. The mother-in-law shook her head, chiding herself. Oh, Mom, you still have that drop of snobbery I told you about earlier, Anthony said with a slight chuckle as he folded the paper. Well, only if the very drop, his mother joked. But actually, I'm very glad Beatrice is going to be educated in the jewelry trade. Just imagine what the future holds for your children, she said dreamily and kissed Alex's silky hair. The most important thing, Mom, is that Beatrice has a good heart in the first place, Anthony replied. A nurse blew a big deal to a rich man by overhearing his wife talking to her lover, and by breaking the pact. After her husband left the family, Emily was left alone with 2 young children. Frankly, it was a blow, a shock. She had never imagined that there was anything wrong with their family. On the contrary, they seemed happy. And then the woman had a harsh confrontation with reality. Her husband Andrew did not even find the strength to explain himself to her, to talk, to clarify the situation. No, he acted like a coward, like a complete scoundrel. He left quietly, wrote a tiny note, and ran away. In fact, silently packed up all his things and left the flat while Emily and the kids were at the clinic. But who does that? Is that dignified? Is that what you expect from the man you lived under the same roof with, had children with? And this note. Emily will never forget this concision from her ex-husband. I can't take it anymore. I'm leaving simply and clearly, so that the woman did not build vain illusions. It was incredibly, simply unbearably painful. Emily couldn't get it into her head. How could he do this to her, to the children? Of course, she rushed to call, only the caller was no longer available. Andrew hadn't run off in a hurry, silently, to explain himself later. Worse, Andrew didn't just run off into the unknown. He took the family's savings with him, took everything they had. Needless to say, the man did not think to pay child support for his children either. It turned out that the monetary collapse was a much bigger shock than the love betrayal. That pain was only emotional, and in the situation with money, Emily faced complete hopelessness and hopelessness. And it would have been fine if she were alone, but she had children on her hands. They needed to be fed, clothed, and how? The unfortunate woman realized quite quickly that tears could not help her grief. You can sit and feel sorry for yourself endlessly, but this will not bring any changes. Food will not appear in the fridge, and money will not fall on the card. I had to pull myself together and act. Through can't and through don't want to pull herself out of the emotional pit for the sake of the children, for their well-being and happy childhood. Emily couldn't afford to let them down, to betray them as her own father had betrayed her. There were no options. It was necessary to start with the smallest and most obvious. First of all, the young woman decided to move in with her mother in her flat. A small flat in the city, Emily and her mom's inheritance. It could be rented out. There was already some money coming in. In the meantime, she could live in the countryside, in a small village with her retired mom. It's even better for the children. Emily tried to reassure herself. In the air, on natural products. In any case, there were no other options. She couldn't even afford to pay the rent. And to go to work, she had to leave her children on someone. Unfortunately, the queue for kindergarten was still not approaching, and Emily could only dream of hiring a nanny. Now, such a luxury she obviously could not afford. Of course, the village is not a city, but there will be at least some opportunity to work part-time, to put drips, injections. After all, Emily had been a nurse before her maternity leave. It's not ideal. But what is better to stay in the city, and in the near future to go to bread and water, begging? Emily preferred honest labor. That's right, don't be a fool. Mrs. Mia fully supported her daughter's decision. I told you a long time ago that you should move with the children to my place. They'll be at ease here, they'll enjoy the fresh air. There's lots of other kids here. Why bother? There was no other way out anyway. I'm almost out of money. I used the last pennies to pay the rent and bought some minimal groceries. I've already found tenants. Seemed like normal people. I've got my things ready and packed. So there's no turning back, Emily sighed bitterly. The idea of returning to her mother in her native village was not very close to her. What was the point of embarrassing Mrs. Mia, a sick pensioner? She loved her grandchildren, of course, but seeing them occasionally or living and looking after 2 children all the time were different things. I didn't want to impose, to force my mum to solve her problems. Emily was not used to help. She became independent early. So the current circumstances forced the woman to literally overcome her fears and expectations. It's okay, Smith. Everything will be all right, Mrs. Mia rejoiced. You'll see, Mrs. Mia said. Well, it happens. Everyone goes through black and gray streaks in life. Who hasn't been betrayed in this life? You just have to learn from it and move on. Yes, Mum, I understand, Emily replied. I don't have time to be discouraged. As soon as we get here, we'll have to find clients and patients so that we can make some money on top of the rent. I can't just sit on your back. Don't worry. I've already told Aunt Amanda. She'll tell everyone you're here and that you need a job. You know how we are with medical care. So I'm sure you'll find someone quickly. It'd be nice if the neighboring village heard about you. People there have good money. They can afford to pay and hire a nurse. Yes, that would be ideal, Emily said dreamily. Indeed, about 10 years ago, a new township for the rich had sprung up in their neighborhood. Apparently they were attracted by nature, fresh air, a lake nearby. Of course, they needed servants and staff. The rich preferred to hire them in the neighboring villages. You can't travel from the city. 5 kilometers away and you're there. Emily's journey was no more than 3.5 kilometers in a straight line, through a forest path. What are they going to do on a bicycle when there's no snow? So the nurse, of course, hoped that there would be patients for her there too. The well-to-do could afford to pay for medical services. It's always easier to take money from someone who has it. Emily knew that she would still take crumbs from some retired grandmother. She couldn't get over herself. That's her upbringing. So Emily and her children moved to their native land, and at first everything seemed sad, anxious, but in reality, everything appeared in a completely different light. The children, a very tiny 2-year-old Anne and 5-year-old Matthew, took the new home with great enthusiasm. Of course, they were cramped in the flat, but here they have space. Everything is interesting, where now city children could see a real cow, goat, and piglets. All in all, the children were delighted. Mum, but we'll live here for a while. The son kept pestering his mother. Yes, we're not going back to town just yet. No, Matthew, I think we'll stay here for a while, Emily smiled. Her heart rejoiced that the children were happy. Wasn't that the most important thing to a mother? Emily was very worried about her children. Did she have anything more precious than them? So gradually, little by little, life began to get better, to get back on track. There were no more fears, you just had to move forward. Especially since Emily simply had no way out. How could she give up, admit her weakness? Only her husband Andrew was capable of that, but not her. Emily did her best to keep her children happy, to make sure that Matthew and Anne didn't need anything. It's not their fault their mum picked such a lousy father for them, she told herself. It wasn't their fault, and it wasn't their fault, and it wasn't their responsibility. What's more, Mrs. Mia had to be taken care of too. It was only now, living with her under the same roof, that her daughter noticed that she had given up a lot lately. And who would take care of them all but her? Who needs them? So regardless, Emily rolled up her sleeves and got to work. There was a lot of walking, cycling, a lot of socializing with seriously ill people. Of course, it was very exhausting both mentally and physically. But the nurse did not think to complain. Everything was going the way she wanted it to. There are patients who are able to pay for the work the same huge thanks. In such a situation, to grumble and complain is only to anger God. When the first regular clients started to appear, life in general began to shine with new colors. Finally gone that negativity of hopelessness and helplessness. And that was the most important thing. In this rhythm of life, the nurse survived for the 3rd month. Everything suited her. Especially fooled the woman that now was not ashamed to look children in the eyes, not refusing in trifles, for which bail lack of money. One day Emily cycled to a neighboring village to visit her regular patient, to whom she was giving vitamin drips to maintain her general tone and health. The nurse liked Mrs. Jane very much. She paid well, she could afford it, she joked, she laughed, she didn't look down on the nurse. I've had my share of that. Their relationship was good, even friendly. Emily's mood that day was combative and upbeat. Mrs. Jane offered her a coffee after the drip. She didn't refuse. The women chatted about nothing, about life. Oops. The patient suddenly came to her senses, clearly remembering something. What a crow. I promised to talk to you and it slipped my mind. Emily was very interested. It would be nice if Mrs. Jane could recommend a nurse to some well-to-do neighbor. Something not quite your profile, she said. But she promised to ask. Maybe you'd be interested. We've got the biggest house in the village on Main Street. Do you know it? The nurse nodded patiently. Of course, it was hard to miss. The owners had obviously invested a great deal in the house, in its decoration. It was clear and visible to the naked eye. The high fence, designed to hide the splendor, only attracted the attention of the curious even more. They're looking for a nurse for the dying master, said Mrs. Jane. He's in very bad health. It looks like terminal cancer. He needs someone with a medical degree. His previous carer left the other day. It's understandable. You have to live here. You can't travel from the city, she continued. What do you think? Not interested? I could recommend you. The salary, I'm sure, is very decent. Emily had her doubts. It's full-time. What about the kids? What about Mum? They can't manage without her, she thought. So Mrs. Mia would have to take care of all the worries and problems. No, it was absolutely impossible to make such a big decision without her. Can I think about it? Replied the nurse politely. I have children, Mum. You know, you have to weigh everything up and think it over. Of course, Mrs. Jane shrugged her shoulders. Well, call. All the way back, Emily thought about the offer. A huge number of disadvantages: full-time work, a seriously ill person, constant presence in someone else's house. But there was a significant upside: the salary. And what to do? Back home, without putting things off, she called her mum in for a chat, told Mrs. Mia everything she knew. What do you think? Emily asked. There are a lot of downsides, but I'm sure the labor will be well paid. You know, money's no object right now. But I don't want to make a decision without you. I mean, this is about you, too. I think I can manage with the children, replied Mum. There's no problem with that. After all, I understand that you can't live long with terminal cancer, right? It doesn't even last long. I'm more concerned about your morale. Being alone with a dying person all the time. Don't worry, it's my job, she smiled as calmly as possible. She didn't want to upset her mother further. It was absolutely unnecessary. Are you sure, Mum? You'll have a lot to worry about, Emily said. I think we should at least try to talk about the terms in more detail. Find out what and how, so you don't regret the opportunity. Fair enough? I'll do that, she nodded to her mum. It was early in the morning when the nurse called Mrs. Jane back. Hello, Mrs. Smith, she said good-naturedly. Good afternoon. I'm sorry to disturb you, said Emily. Can you tell me about the offer you made yesterday? Is it still valid? The nurse came straight to the point. I need to contact the landlady, Mrs. Chloe, and then I'll know. I'll ring her, ask her. If you still need a member of staff, she'll call you back. I'll give her your number. That'll do, Emily said. Yes, of course, thank you so much. You're welcome. Mrs. Jane replied politely and disconnected. It was as if she were glad to be a part of someone else's fate. Indeed, not an hour later, Emily's phone came to life, calling an unknown number. It was the same Mrs. Chloe. A carer was still needed. They were on the lookout for a decent person and a professional. As the landlady immediately indicated, judging by the voice, it was a middle-aged woman, quite polite, Emily thought. There was a slight swagger and arrogance in her tone, but within acceptable limits. After all, by then she was used to worse treatment from those in power. The lady invited Emily for an interview, reasonably noting that they should look at each other in person, and then discuss the terms of employment in detail. By lunchtime, Emily arrived at the same luxurious house. A little worried inside, she reassured herself that she had not agreed to anything yet. As long as they only discussed the terms in detail, one could always politely decline. She's human too, after all, she has a right? That gave Emily's confidence a little boost. Surprisingly, the owner of the house, the wife of Emily's potential patient, Mrs. Chloe, seemed very friendly and calm. Periodically in this village, she was no longer surprised at the rudeness or neglect. But calmness and good-naturedness really struck her with novelty. Of course, there were exceptions. For example, the wonderful Mrs. Jane. But they were few, unfortunately. Mrs. Chloe gave Emily a detailed outline of her tasks and responsibilities. The pay was indeed magnificent. The nurse was overwhelmed by the generosity of the owners. Of course, the services were not free. The demands on the nurse were also very high. The most unpleasant news for Emily was that the owners required the nurse to live right here, in their house, to be with the patient. However, she was given one day off a week, Sunday, of course with the proviso that nothing extraordinary happened, and the patient was stable. So what was to be done? What was to be done? Emily was confused. With her mum, she had discussed at least a partial presence at home. Mrs. Mia was brave, but what would she be like with the kids 6 days a week, 24 hours a day? On the other hand, Mum wouldn't understand if Emily said no. Meanwhile, the landlady, noticing the confusion in Emily's eyes, wasn't about to give up. "I know it's a lot to ask," she said, "but my husband, Mr. Matthew, needs round-the-clock care. He's hard to get along with people and hard to get along with new acquaintances. But you must admit, we are prepared to pay a decent fee for your services," said Mrs. Chloe. "Of course, there is no question about that," Emily responded. "Just understand me. It's not an easy choice. I have a mum and 2 young children at home." Mrs. Chloe's face showed disappointment. Weighing the pros and cons carefully again, Emily decided to take the job. The pay was too good. It was a sin to refuse. If Mum was having a hard time, she could find a nanny too. With the income she had, she could afford it. Especially since jobs were scarce in their town. Local girls would gladly agree to look after children, not for fabulous sums. It was decided. Among other things, there were some other rules, which the hostess thoroughly voiced at once. Some of them confused the prospective carer a little. For example, Mrs. Chloe wanted to be aware of absolutely everything that happens to her husband. His state of health, of course, was part of her affairs. But the list didn't stop there. The spouse seemed to ask additionally to spy on the dying. Or was that just Emily's impression? The nurse had assumed that Mr. Matthew was the first to be satisfied with her services. In fact, it appeared that Mrs. Chloe was the center of all decision-making for her husband. This confused Emily, but she quickly worked out a logical explanation for herself. Perhaps Mrs. Chloe was showing her love and concern for the dying man by such suffocating control. It happens, doesn't it? People are different and deal with stress and grief in different ways. It would have been possible to have a long internal dialogue, to doubt, to search for arguments, to wonder. But what good was that going to do? Emily resolutely reminded herself that her job was to serve. What was she, in fact, a servant? What right does she have to meddle in the relationship of spouses, especially in such a difficult life situation? It is necessary to remember their place and the circle of duties, but fulfill them as agreed. After all, she was warned about everything at once. So what now? Now that that's settled, it's time to meet your ward. Mr. Matthew surprised Emily at first sight. For one thing, he was much older than she'd realized. She had probably inferred this from the age of his wife, thinking they were almost the same age. In fact, it turned out that the man was about 20 to 25 years older than his wife. If Mrs. Chloe gave the impression of a blooming and well-groomed middle-aged woman, Mr. Matthew, it was immediately obvious, was at a rather advanced age. And of course, illness does not make anyone look young or beautiful. That the patient was seriously ill was evident without a word. He was thin to the point of dryness, his face was grayish-yellow, and his eyes were tired and sore. However, Mrs. Chloe confirmed her husband's diagnosis, which her neighbor Mrs. Jane had given Emily. The man had terminal kidney cancer. There was nothing that could be done. There was no miracle. No, all the patient needed now was to relieve the pain and support his body as best he could. Emily was a familiar person, so surprise was not reflected on her face. On the contrary, she stepped towards the prospective patient with a good-natured smile. "Good afternoon, Mr. Matthew. I'm Emily, your nurse, if you'll excuse me." "Hello," the man said hoarsely. "Well, let's get acquainted. Chloe, you can go on. I can do it myself," he turned to his wife, who brought the nurse. The woman nodded and immediately retreated. It was clear at once that no one argues or bickers with the owner of the house. If anything is done against his will, it is done secretly behind his back. As soon as the wife went out and closed the door behind her, the man turned to Emily again. "Please sit down. Now I need to look at you closely to decide if you're right for me." Strange. The owner of the house spoke very politely, calmly, unusually respectful and intelligent. But still Emily's insides clenched. She didn't remember the rest of her conversation with Mr. Matthew very well. For the most part, it was like an interrogation. The patient asked questions, looking at her with challenge and interest. He seemed less interested in the answers themselves than in the nurse's reactions. Emily was terribly frightened and almost mesmerized by this tired stare across the room. Finally, Mr. Matthew clapped his hands on his leg. "Yes, you're definitely the right man for me. I apologize for asking you. I may have overstepped the mark somewhere. But you see, I had to realize who I was going to spend the rest of my life with." It was a bold and even impertinent statement. What was I supposed to say to him? It was foolish to refuse and say that everything was still ahead of me. There was no reason to give up on herself. It would only offend the man, because everything is already clear. Why this pretense? So Emily could only squeeze out a neutral word. "I understand perfectly." The next day, from the very early morning, Emily was picked up from the house by a driver. That was the arrangement, because the carer had to take her personal belongings with her. That's how her work at the home began. She drove to the neighboring town with mixed feelings. To be honest, she was already regretting and corrupting herself for taking the job. She was really intimidated by Mr. Matthew, his tenacious gaze as if he could look deep inside. Strangely, on the first day of work, the patient no longer looked so intimidating. On the contrary, the man was joking, trying to lighten the mood. There was no trace of that awful feeling of heaviness. Emily began to exhale a little, as she had to adapt to her new circumstances. It might seem silly, but the woman's anxiety wasn't going anywhere, not by a long shot. She was terribly uncomfortable in this house. Why? At first, Emily wrote it off to the lack of habit to live in such luxury, to adapt to new realities and new people around. But no, there were strange things about it. From the first days of her life in the mansion, the observant Emily began to notice something wrong. She seemed to be the mistress of the house, so intelligent, calm, polite. But everyone in the house walks on tiptoe in front of her and is clearly afraid of her. Why? Isn't it strange? It would be understandable if Mrs. Chloe were a tyrannical tyrant. But no, the nurse hasn't noticed anything like that about her. Not yet, anyway. Or was it just her? Was the landlady more demanding of the others? The house was as quiet as a crypt. For a mother of 2 children, accustomed to children's laughter, screams, and various sounds, this silence was terribly unusual. This, too, was blamed on the peculiarities of the character of the owners. Few people are sensitive to sounds. Why not? Then the nurse learnt that no one was allowed to appear at the landlady's house without Mrs. Chloe calling. There was a floor of the house, the last, 3rd floor, and no one was allowed to go up there without prior approval. Even the maid cleaned there in the presence of the mistress. Strange, isn't it? Usually it was the other way around. It surprised Emily so much that she couldn't stand it and asked Amanda, the head housekeeper who was in charge of all the staff, a direct question. Why is it like this? Isn't it strange? But the curiosity was immediately condemned. Amanda coldly glared at the woman who was prying. Emily, she said formally and firmly, in this house you don't ask questions, you just follow orders or you're out of here in a flash. She got what she deserved, of course. As they say, curiosity is not a vice, but it's a big pig. That's true. Except that the nurse couldn't rest. And these secrets, this arrogant answer of Amanda's, only made her want to know what was going on. In her free time, Emily began to look around, to listen discreetly, and slowly from the others showed interest in the third floor of the house. It was just awfully interesting to find out what it was all about. But you can't guard nothing so meticulously if there's no mystery to it, can you? And one had to amuse oneself. Mr. Matthew grew tired very quickly and often dozed off. It was soon discovered that Mrs. Chloe had an additional entrance to her third floor. So yes, it was accessed in the traditional way, simply by going up the main staircase. But there was an additional route. Emily had learnt about it quite by accident. At night she couldn't sleep, so she read by the window with her e-reader open, without turning on the light. She enjoyed occasionally looking up from her book and gazing at the beautiful moon. The view from the first floor of the house was magical because of the proximity of the water. The nurse was distracted from her book by the sound of the front gate opening. Needless to say, she began to watch carefully to see what was going on, who could be arriving at 3 a.m. The car was unfamiliar to her, but she couldn't see much. The car instantly rolled away into the garage. No one ever came out of the garage. Yes, there was an entrance to the house, but the woman would have heard it. The door from there was almost directly below her room. But there were sounds on the third floor. Something was going on up there. Too bad it was impossible to make out anything. The soundproofing in the house was excellent, but there could be no doubt. Whoever this night visitor was, he bypassed the first floor of the house and went straight up to Mrs. Chloe's apartment. The conclusion lay on the surface. In the huge house there were additional passages, entrances of which not everyone was aware. Now it became clear that the landlady was so sensitive about unexpected visitors to her floor. She did not need unnecessary witnesses. Even if it was still unsubstantiated, Emily was convinced in her heart that her mistress was visited by her lover at night in secret. Why not? She thought. She's still a fairly young woman. Nature takes its course. Though it was a bit of a shame about Mr. Matthew. What about him? It was only the woman's inner torment. There was no thought of intruding into the private affairs of the couple. She had satisfied her curiosity. Now everything fell into place. It was simple, even banal. The secret of the lady of the house was as old as the world. From that day on, Emily was completely at ease. Why was she afraid she'd stumble upon some scary skeletons in the wardrobe? What was really to be feared? And a lover, what a thing. Except that the nurse's previous interest did not go unnoticed by the house staff. Kate, the young housekeeper maid, even decided to give her colleague some unsolicited advice over a cup of tea. And the girl, lowering her voice, said, "It's none of my business, but I'd like to warn you. Be aware that in this house snitch on snitch. Don't lose your job because of your long nose." Emily pretended not to understand what she was talking about. "Why would I be in trouble?" "I don't get it, Kate. What are you talking about?" "Everyone here knows you've been asking Amanda all sorts of questions about her mistress's oddities," the maid retorted. The nurse wasn't about to give up and just shrugged. It just seemed odd. So I asked her if there was anything she needed to know. "Maybe Mrs. Chloe's got a crocodile living there. How would I know?" Emily said, deliberately slipping into absurdity to nip this conversation in the bud. She didn't like what Kate had said, and she didn't want to continue this conversation. She didn't want to involve herself in these internal matters. "Come on, have you seen Mrs. Chloe's lover yet?" Kate asked her forehead. Only Emily decided to use the advice that had just come to keep her mouth shut. I mean, there are snitches. "I don't know what you're talking about right now," Kate the nurse said as seriously as she could. Why did she want to go to all this trouble? Kate was defiantly silent in response. Of course she didn't believe it, but she had no evidence to the contrary, which was a good thing. Emily hadn't even told her mum about seeing a mysterious overnight visitor who'd inexplicably ended up on the top floor of the house. She didn't need all that smutty gossip and idle talk. The nurse reasoned pragmatically her career in this house was fleeting, so it was a great folly to ask questions and show interest. She should have been smarter than that. To go about her business quietly, stay out of the way, get paid, and exist quietly and peacefully with everyone under the same roof. After Mr. Matthew's death, Emily would have to look for a new job, and the widow's recommendations would be useful. Cynical, I suppose, but it's the truth of life. To take her mind off what was going on in the house, Emily went to work. She was already very conscientious about her duties, and now she was concentrating on Mr. Matthew. She tried to do her best to make the patient feel as good as possible, both physically and mentally. It was her job to relieve the man's condition, which Emily did from morning to night. At first, they got to know each other. The businessman was wary of the nurse. His character and difficult life and professional path strongly affected his attitude to people and to life in general. After a while, when Mr. Matthew got used to the carer, he began to treat her more and more warmly. He told her things, showed her things, explained things. It must be said that Emily was also very interested. She admired the man's life, his experience and knowledge. The patient found in the nurse an outlet. He could see that Emily was completely sincere about him. Yes, she worked here, but it was not her job to feign curiosity or interest, to talk about herself, to share news. Mr. Matthew, in turn, was interested in the woman's life, children, her life in general. As it turned out, despite the huge money, the businessman was now very lonely. The disease had done a terrible thing to him, cut off the way to communicate with the world. His strength was not the same. His health was failing. He could no longer afford to go about his business, to solve problems, to act. And that was his life. He breathed it. And now he'd been cooped up before Emily came along. In fact, the businessman's entire social circle was his wife and domestic staff. Occasionally, doctors and other medical professionals would show up. Occasionally, when the situation was extraordinary, Mr. Matthew would also be contacted by the manager, on whom the business and affairs now rested. And that, even these contacts were infrequent. All communications were strictly controlled and regulated by Mrs. Chloe. Of course, she was guided primarily by the care of her husband. He was not allowed to strain himself for trifles. The businessman resisted. It seemed to him that the disease is not a verdict. After all, medicine has made such a step forward. But the only thing is that both our and foreign specialists have divorced their hands too late. Unfortunately, the disease had gone too far. To Mr. Matthew's credit, it should be noted that even after hearing the verdict, he did not think of giving up. He believed and hoped that everything was still ahead of him, that a miracle would happen. The man did not think to slow down the old pace of life, to change his hardened habits. And that's when his body gave up. In addition to the underlying disease, the man had a heart attack. This finally crippled him. "Are you in a big hurry to get to the other side?" resented, without hiding his emotions, the attending physician. It was natural and fair Mr. Matthew finished his story to Emily. Health is not ironclad, as it turned out. Suddenly I was aging, like all mortals. I didn't want to believe it. The nurse nodded sympathetically. She understood the old man's emotions. How many times she had heard such stories from her patients. Yes, unfortunately, a man realizes that he is mortal and fragile too late. Now, Mrs. Chloe took this situation into consideration and began to use it as a final argument in any dispute with her husband. In this way, she managed to restrict his communication and put him in the house. The patient complained. "Now, Chloe always tells me that it's not enough what happened. Don't you get it the first time? What can you say? What can you say?" Emily understood one thing: Mr. Matthew was very unhappy with the situation, but could not do anything. He was very ill indeed, and it was not even within his manly power to change anything. His vulnerability was enormous. She felt sorry for this elderly, tired, dying man. But what could she do? Except sit and chat, try to cheer him up or make him laugh, play his favorite game of backgammon. Whatever was within her power and her modest capabilities, Emily was happy to do. It was such a pleasure to see the old man's face sometimes genuinely light up with warmth and joy. Thoughts of Mr. Matthew never left Emily. Even on the one day off she spent at home with the children and Mrs. Mia's mother. Something was keeping the woman on edge. She couldn't get her patient out of her mind, even though it seemed as if she longed to be with her beloved family. But even away from the mansion, her thoughts overcame her. Mrs. Mia couldn't help but notice the change in her daughter. "So tell me, what's wrong? What's going on in this house? You're not yourself." At first, Emily tried to avoid direct questions. She didn't feel comfortable gossiping, discussing other people's lives. But her mom wouldn't give up. "Daughter, but look at yourself. If it's so terrible, let's leave this job. God, with the money, we'll get by just fine." The unhappy woman really couldn't find any peace. Who but she knew and felt her daughter? Emily only gave in because her heart was very heavy. There were thoughts of Mr. Matthew and of the situation in the house, and her mother's anguish only added to her neurosis. Moreover, knowing her mother, the woman did not worry this information will not go anywhere beyond these walls and will not become public. And Emily shared all her experiences and observations under the eyes and heavy sighs of Mrs. Mia. You see, my heart is troubled for him. Leaving him behind makes it hard. Even though I'm coming to see you, I know I'll finally get to see Anne and Matthew off the video link. Daughter, I know you have a heart of gold, but you can't do this. Why do you have to be so hard on yourself? The man is leaving. His journey on earth is almost over. Why kill yourself over him? Especially since it was only his choice that led to such a finale and sunset. I'm not happy, of course, but what can I do? His loneliness cuts me like a knife. And Mrs. Chloe has a lover behind her husband's back. I can't believe it. I wish I'd gone to the old man's house more often. Anyway, Mum strongly advised Emily not to interfere. What's the use of interfering? You realize you're the one who's going to be the one to blame. And who's really going to listen to you? Yes, I understand, Mum, but I feel sorry for him. It's the boredom and loneliness that's killing him more than the illness. And his wife is just manipulating him, pushing his buttons. That's all. But you can't help everyone. Take pity on yourself, on your nervous system. You can help him just by doing what you can. But you can't meddle in other people's affairs, it's too dangerous. The nurse nodded in agreement. Of course, these exhortations from her mother were perfectly logical and fair. No one would argue. But what to do with her feelings and emotions was the question. It had been like this for almost 3 months now. It could not be said that the time flew by quickly, rather strictly on the contrary. Every day in the mansion was a torment for Emily. Oh, how she would love to give up this job. Everything about the house exhausted and irritated her. The more she learned, the more she became involved in the local customs, the worse it became. She was literally short of breath. What money was there? Already everything was no fun. It's amazingly simple. You look at the extremely wealthy people from the outside and only snort disdainfully. What's your problem? Money can buy everything. Emily, too, was a victim of that stereotype. It always seems that way when you're struggling for a pittance. But now the nurse was plunged headfirst into that world, and she wasn't happy about it. God, I'd rather be on the dole than this horror. This money really does spoil people. Mrs. Chloe no longer seemed the same to Emily as when she first met her. Now, having lived with her under the same roof, the woman saw her true nature, her arrogance, saw the consumerist and manipulative attitude to the old man's husband. It was just an unbearable, inhuman sight. Sometimes I wanted to stand up and say, "What are you doing?" But, according to her mother's precept, she humbly kept silent, no matter how sorry she felt for the businessman. Only she was right. Isn't Mr. Matthew to blame for everything? Is it not his fault and his connivance in all that is happening? Didn't he marry young and beautiful? Why should Emily now lay her head on the scaffold to save him because of this? Mrs. Chloe's lover came more and more frequently. His presence in the house was still carefully concealed, but all the household seemed to have known about him for a long time, except the master of the house, of course. Lately, though, the nurse began to think that he, too, had guessed what was going on behind his back. He only kept silent because he couldn't do anything anyway. In general, this environment of endless lies, deceit, self-interest, and inhumanity drove Emily to despair. She sobbed, resisting with all her might. And she would have left, honestly, if it hadn't been for one thing: she didn't want to leave Mr. Matthew. She didn't. Not even it was his own fault. It was his own fault. It was his own fault that he wanted to marry a mannequin. Auto training didn't help. Nothing helped. Instead of rationality was the usual female heartfelt pity. After all, how long did he have left? Emily knew for sure. Not long. And wasn't it worth stepping on the throat of her own song just to brighten the dying man's last days, to keep him from being sad? To amuse him, to entertain him, to distract him from his sad thoughts. After all, there is no guarantee that the new carer will not just be formal about everything. After all, that's all the landlady asked for. Everything else was already Emily's personal initiative. No, I can't do that. I will be with him until the end, the woman resolutely summed up all her doubts and metamorphoses. After all, she had a conscience, and then she would have to live with the burden on her heart. What was there to be patient about? At least because of this. At least for the sake of herself and her selfishness. After making the final decision, it was somehow easier on her soul. After all, there was no longer that inner pendulum. Now the nurse saw a clear end in front of her, the death of her patient. And she would be with him to the end. A week or so passed and everything was going relatively smoothly and calmly. Nothing heralded a new blow and a new calamity. This night the nurse, as usual, did not sleep. Damn this house. It really did give the woman sad thoughts and a depressing effect on her psyche. The nurse tiptoed into Mr. Matthews' room. In the dark she could see well at night, and she could navigate the house very well, too. She felt uneasy, so she decided to visit the old man one more time, as she was accustomed to do. Even if there was no call, she still checked on him. There was nothing to worry about. This time everything was quiet. The man was sleeping peacefully, breathing evenly, not a cause for concern. Emily mentally crossed herself. Thank God, all is well. The thing was, Mr. Matthew was looking worse and worse, and the end was clearly near, hence the woman's anxious state of mind was only growing. How long does he have left? A week? A month? No one knew how much longer the tired, powerless organism would struggle, but as the nurse exhaled heavily, relief from her heart, at least for a period of time. There was no sleep in either eye. The nurse decided to go down quietly to the ground floor, walk to the kitchen, and get a drink of water. The nerves made her mouth terribly dry. In order not to attract unnecessary attention of the staff, the nurse decided not to switch on the light. Why? She could see everything perfectly well as it was. She was already familiar with almost every corner of the house, except Mrs. Chloe's room on the third floor, of course. Emily had never been there. Still in her thoughts, the woman moved down the stairs, treading carefully, moving as quietly as possible. It would seem that there was no need to hide. She had done nothing of the sort. So much for going to the kitchen at night to get water. But just in case, Emily was used to blending in with the walls in the house. The safest way to live here was to keep a low profile. And just then, on a flight of stairs just between the first and first floors, the nurse heard that there was someone on the ground floor. The sounds of two voices were clearly coming to her. This was strange. The landlady didn't usually come downstairs, and the servants had long been asleep. Who could it be, and how long had it been going on? Emily realized that she might not have heard something, being inside herself, having her own internal dialogue. The people downstairs were arguing heatedly about something, though they were trying to keep it as quiet as possible. The nurse froze in panic, as if she had been caught by someone in the act of committing a crime. A completely incomprehensible and inexplicable feeling. Why all of a sudden? But inside, everything was screaming danger. The body was furiously waving a red flag. Why was this happening? Emily didn't even understand at first what the reason for such a nervous reaction was, and only then logic pulled up following the conclusion that had long since been drawn by the subconscious and the inner voice. Right? This house is all about secrets. Everyone lives in suspense. And what if the mistress found out that the servants had overheard something that should not have touched her ears? There was no doubt about it, the decision would be unequivocal. And the bystander would be thrown out in a flash. Her heart was pounding frantically. A second thought came to her: what if Emily's only fooling herself? What if it's just someone on the staff fighting? Why would she immediately think something bad? The woman, barely containing her anxiety and tremendous inner tension, froze in place and turned to listen. To be honest, she didn't care at all about the interesting conversation, which by its format resembled more of a clarification of relations. She was only interested in one thing: how not to get caught. She reasoned that whoever was there would be better off if the others remained blissfully ignorant of the fact that their conversation had a bystander. The nurse didn't want trouble with any of the residents of the house, not even the maid or the gardener. The nurse had wanted to go up to the first floor and hide in her room. Except that now it was risky. She might make an accidental noise or touch something, or trip. It's always the law of meanness when you're trying to be quieter than water. Don't make a move. It's better to wait. There wasn't much chance of being caught on the stairs. All the house staff lived on the ground floor except for her. Emily lived in the next room to the master, which was reasonable and justified. The problem could arise if the landlady herself was in the kitchen, but that was unlikely. To avoid misunderstandings and unpleasant encounters, Emily strained and listened to see where the people arguing were. It was decided if people were coming this way, then she would take her chances and start climbing up to her place. For now, she would wait. Maybe Emily's behavior wasn't the most logical. Afterwards, in hindsight, she had reasoned and thought many times about the best course of action. Only what good would it do now? A person who is in constant nervous tension, caught by surprise at night, does not always reason as logically, sensibly, and reasonably as a person in other, more typical and stable circumstances. She could blame herself all she wanted now, but what had been done couldn't be undone. Emily froze on a flight of stairs in complete darkness, listening to the voices that came to her, barely audibly concentrating on the sounds from outside. The nurse immediately recognized the woman's voice. The most frightening theory was confirmed. It was Mrs. Chloe. The male voice was unfamiliar to her, although by the emotional message and the manner of communication between the couple it was immediately clear that this man was the mysterious lover of the mistress. Damn it, she cursed to herself. Her thoughts were racing what to do now? Run or freeze with terror and panic? The carer chose the second option. She turned into a plaster statue, unable to move. Her heart was pounding so hard she thought she could hear it a few meters away. Her head rumbled and her mouth felt even more dry. She was incredibly scared to stay here and scared to run away. Worse, now she heard bits of phrases, some details of the conversation, and a cold sweat broke through her insides. Mother dear. The poor, already terrified woman nearly had a panic attack. Emily no longer had any illusions about her landlady. In the month she'd been in the house, she'd already worked out what Mrs. Chloe really was. But there were limits. Everything has limits. You don't realize how urgent this is, she whispered, trying not to raise her voice. That old goat could die any minute. So what then? A male voice instantly parried. Don't you realize that there's no hurry? He's sick, but not insane, in case you haven't forgotten. And if he guesses, suspects something wrong, what then? Not only will he not sign a bloody thing, but can you imagine our prospects if it all comes out? Like we didn't take risks before. We don't have time for small talk in front of this old bloke now. Do you understand? Mr. Matthew could be finished at any minute. The lover was clearly angry, and he didn't even hide it. The next phrase he said with a burst, even with some aggression, though with a share of some fatigue. My God, Chloe, and what do you suggest? What do you want exactly? And the hostess apparently only waited for this. She seemed eager to share her plan. I'll try to slip him a deed of gift, she said. Among other documents, of course, to increase our chances of success, we could switch his glasses, for example. As she finished her thought, Mrs. Chloe breathed heavily, so heavily that even Emily could hear it. She was clearly waiting for the man's reaction, what he would say, how he would react. But he was in no hurry to share his opinion. A tense silence hung. It's a crude idea, but it's interesting, he finally said. It could work. But will Mr. Matthews sign the papers if he can't see the text? He would never have made such a mistake before. He would. Mr. Matthews' wife exclaimed confidently. He just needs the old man to be in the right condition, tired, exhausted. Preferably right after a shot of morphine. I know what the anesthetic does to him. It's not hard now. He's in so much pain that he gets injections several times a day. The lover replied after a short pause with some thoughtfulness in his voice. Well, yes, perhaps it could work then, but that's only a possibility. Don't forget that there is also a huge risk. He who doesn't take risks doesn't drink expensive champagne and dies poor, the woman retorted angrily. I'm not ready not to at least try. Have you seen the current will? I'll be a pauper with a pittance to my name. You're right about that. The benefits and the prospects are tempting. That's what I'm talking about. Sweetheart, shall we all go back to the bedroom? The poor nurse continued to stand motionless. What was she going to do now? The panic inside was only growing. Here now the lovers would go to their main staircase and discover her. Just awful. Stupid. But from panic and from shock, Emily couldn't decide what to do. Just stood motionless, hesitant to do anything. Like that indecisive person, afraid to make any decision at all. After a few minutes, Emily realized that the people below had left. They couldn't have come up so slowly. No, that's right. They'd just gone downstairs, apparently into the garage to climb back up to the third floor undetected by their separate staircase. It's impossible to describe the nurse's emotions at that moment. She almost died of fear. Unable to bear the strain, Emily sank straight down onto the marble staircase. Her legs wouldn't hold up any longer. Her body seemed to have exhausted its last resources. She had a terrible urge to cry, to feel sorry for herself, for Mr. Matthew, for the injustice of the world. A lump came to her throat. It was probably at least 20 minutes before the nurse forced herself up with a willful decision. She had to at least make it to the kitchen, to finally get a drink of water. She was literally dying of thirst. Climbing down the stairs on woozy, still naughty legs, Emily drank a liter of water in a gulp. She couldn't get drunk and she couldn't catch her breath. The woman was scared as it was, but this incident of eavesdropping on a conversation was crossing all possible boundaries. There was only one question: God, what am I going to do about this now? Emily was angry with herself. She had to be in this place at this minute. Ah, with what happiness she would have remained in ignorance. Who would have known why she needed someone else's problems? And what to do with this knowledge now? Only unnecessary torment and remorse. There's no real way out. It is necessary to admit, at least to herself, she was in a hopeless situation. There's nothing she can do. Who will believe her? It's word against word. Only Mrs. Chloe's word would be more authoritative, more meaningful. And then who would believe her? A simple carer. It seemed the most sensible course of action was to just stay out of it, to forget this night's incident like a nightmare. Nothing had happened. After all, it would be better that way, and rightly so. Since that damn night, Emily had been walking around the house like a shadow. She'd been careful before not to have contact with anyone except Mr. Matthew, not to be seen by anyone, not now. When she heard her mistress's voice, the nurse tried to get away immediately. She was afraid that Mrs. Chloe would know from the look on her face that she was aware of it. The woman knew well enough that she was not a very good actress. Perhaps the fear was in vain, but why test fate? She tried to forget about that unfortunate, accidentally overheard conversation between lovers. To be honest, Emily wasn't doing a very good job. Her thoughts kept revolving around one topic. She kept trying to figure out how to proceed. Should she listen to her conscience or be coldly calculating? She was desperate to consult her mother. Mrs. Mia always knew how to find the right approach, the right words. But how to tell her over the phone was impossible. It's only Thursday night. There's still a lot of time before the next day off. What if Mrs. Chloe plans to do her dirty deeds before then? Or worse, in the absence of a carer? Obviously, a decision had to be made. Only Emily was having a complete paralysis of will here. An unbearably difficult choice. She wanted very much to shift the responsibility for the decision to anyone else, but not to take this huge burden on her shoulders. Emily was very angry at herself, at the fate that had put her in this position. Certainly at her lover, yes, even at Mr. Matthew. On Friday morning, out of the blue, the landlady announced to Emily, "Mr. Matthew needs a routine check-up at the clinic. Then we have business to attend to. So you're free until 5 this evening." "Are you sure you won't need me? You won't need any help?" Mrs. Chloe only gave the nurse a negative nod of her head. "Well, that's lucky. So we could go home and talk to Mum." Emily didn't know what kind of reaction Mrs. Mia was expecting. To put it bluntly, she needed the advice to put the responsibility on someone else's shoulders. Emily expected to do exactly as her mother suggested. She was sick of thinking about it herself. How tired she was of the house, the dying patient, the constant worry. And this situation, she wanted to get away from it all, to rest, to take time out. Mrs. Mia, listening to her daughter's detailed account, gasped, "Emily, I don't even know what to advise you. It's like a vicious circle. You don't even know what's the best thing to do." "I don't know either," Emily said. "I wish I could just walk out of there and never come back. But how can I leave Mr. Matthew? It would be a betrayal." "Oh, I don't know. What if you interfere? Have you thought about what it might do to you?" "Let's be reasonable and objective," Mum urged. "There's a very good chance that you'll achieve nothing but suffer in vain." The nurse listened to Mum in silence. "She's right. Yes, she's absolutely right." Emily thought about it herself. Imagine, Mrs. Mia went on, you'll only bring a great power upon yourself, this Mrs. Chloe, also her lover. God knows who he is. You're playing blind. What's it going to come out to? Nothing good. And in that orbit it'll be you, the kids, me. Everything could be at stake. I mean, we're talking about colossal amounts of money, aren't we? Mum, I know all this, Emily exclaimed. Do you know how many times I've run every possible scenario through my head? Believe me, countless. And what's the main conclusion? I don't care about my conscience or my honor. Pardon the high-handedness. Mother. Mrs. Mia watched her only daughter's torment with bitterness. She understood her perfectly well. She understood her distress. She wanted so much to help her. The woman understood how to do it, to take the blow for herself, offering a ready-made solution. Yes, leave it as it is, she nodded. Mr. Matthew knew perfectly well who he had married. He'd done it all on his own. No one forced him. It's not your business to save his capital now. It would cost you a lot of money. And for what? There's a good chance he'll die in blissful ignorance. You're the one who says he doesn't have long to live. Emily listened carefully to her mother and only sighed heavily. Of course, if you looked at the situation rationally, if you approached it with a cool head, of course Mum was right. Except where to put that damn conscience that was pushing her towards an emotional and stupid decision. Emily nodded and even gave Mrs. Mia her promise to stay out of other people's problems. She was having a hard time with that, a very hard time. The woman crossed her daughter in farewell and shouted, "Be good." Emily wanted to believe that she would do it, that she would keep her promise to her mother. It's over. It had to be accepted as a fait accompli. The decision had been made, and there was no turning back. But that was easy to say, but not to accept. The nurse's heart and soul were still not in the right place. It was good that things were going peacefully and quietly in the house. There was no new upheaval. I wonder if this was the calm before the storm. Whatever it was, Emily even calmed down a little. Talking to her mum had done her good, calmed her down. She sort of accepted the whole situation for what it was. On Sunday she didn't get to go home. The old man was not well at all. She wouldn't have left him like that herself. And the landlady came round and reminded her. Emily, you remember our condition. This is a force majeure. I can't let you go. I understand. Of course I'll stay with Mr. Matthew. Don't worry, Emily replied. There was a moment when the woman thought, this is the end, but the patient's condition suddenly improved. Emily's joy was genuine. The man had become very dear to her. On Tuesday afternoon, Mrs. Chloe found the nurse in the kitchen as she ran in for a bite to eat. Mr. Matthew needs an injection urgently, she said. We've got things to do in half an hour, Mrs. Chloe said in a commanding tone. There's no way we can put them off for a couple of hours. You may be excused, but be at home just in case. Emily, of course, understood at once. Today was the ex-day the lovers had agreed on. Mr. Matthew's crisis had spurred them into action. It was clear that they could not delay any longer, that it was dangerous. So it was now or never. The nurse meekly did as Mrs. Chloe demanded and retired to her room. She wanted to be away from her master's study, where the meanness would be done, to abstract herself from the situation, from the outside world. Emily even began to read a book, but realization eluded her. It was simple, her thoughts were not here. No, she couldn't do this. How could she even live with herself after this? Emily clearly realized she wouldn't be able to resist her gut, her conscience that was screaming and begging for action. She was angry at herself, at her integrity, her honesty, her integrity, and her uncompromising character. Emily stood up resolutely and walked out of the room. She headed straight for Mr. Matthew's office, where the action was now unfolding. She stopped at the door. It would be a good idea to see what was going on in there. She didn't want to burst into the office without any information. She leaned over to the keyhole, listening. As expected, 3 people were present, all the same characters: Mr. Matthew, Mrs. Chloe, and her lover. The male voice the nurse recognized at once, and it brought her back to the memory of that terrible night, overwhelmed with emotion. There was no place for them now. Emily turned to listen. How quickly it became clear the mistress's lover had been at this meeting for a reason. He was, as it turned out, also Mr. Matthew's notary. What a simple mystery. Now the lover's plan was clear. Mrs. Chloe sang in a sweet voice to her ailing husband. "Darling, but you do realize that this is a very good deal. The benefits will be enormous. You can't pass up a chance like this. It's just stupid." The old man obviously listened, as he was in a kind of prostration, which is not surprising if you remember about the recent horse dose of anesthetic. But the businessman tried not to show it. "I've read the CFO and development director's reports. Yeah, you're probably right. It's a nice piece of business. I think we're very lucky." "It's all ready to go," Mrs. Chloe said. "Michael's prepared all the documents. They just need to be signed, just like we agreed." "Well, let's sign them." The businessman exhaled heavily. This business conversation was given to him with obvious difficulty in overcoming. Emily wasn't even sure that he understood exactly what was going on. Emily was jolted by the next question Mr. Matthew asked. "Look, what's wrong with my glasses? I can't see a damn thing. I can't focus my eyes. I can't focus my eyes," the old man complained. His wife, obviously, expected this complaint and answered as casually as possible. "Everything seems to be all right, not cloudy. Would you like me to bring you a napkin to wipe them?" Emily thought that the voice of the hostess still a little trembling. Or was it just that? Characteristically, the notary, aka the mistress's lover, was silent. Cunning, not such a fool as to set himself up and raise his voice. Of course, there's no telling how things might turn out. "You shouldn't," Mr. Matthew replied good-naturedly to his wife's suggestion. His eyesight must have gone completely blank. "I'm not surprised at anything anymore. It's a bloody old disease. All right, Michael, you've read and checked everything carefully. I'll sign it." "I'm so tired," I heard the rustle of paper as the old man flipped through the documents. This was the decision point here, and now it was make up your mind or run away, throwing away all doubts. Emily flew into the patient's office in a whirlwind. She did not think to stop, hurrying to the table where the sick businessman was sitting. From surprise, the hostess at first even shrieked. Of course, her heart had probably frozen in anticipation of a huge score. And now this surprise. "What's going on here? What do you think you're doing?" Mrs. Chloe shouted in an angry voice. But Emily wasn't going to stop. It was not for this that she had dared so long to be timid at this shout. No, she paid no attention to her hostess or to the speechless men. Emily rushed to the table without a word. She snatched the pile of documents from Mr. Matthew's hands and with a swift movement tore them in half. Among other things, there was a deed of gift. The woman didn't doubt that for a second. It was already a silent scene. The notary, Mrs. Chloe's lover, only flapped his eyes in amazement. Apparently, he had not yet decided how to react. The already lethargic Mr. Matthew also just stared at the nurse. A mute question lingered in his eyes, "What's wrong?" but he remained silent, continuing to stare at her in bewilderment. Emily, meanwhile, was trying to catch her breath. Only Mrs. Chloe wouldn't stop. She was literally like a hysterical woman, shouting at the servants in a bad voice. "Girl, what do you think you're doing? What have you done, you idiot?" Mrs. Chloe obviously had many other insulting epithets. Emily did not even doubt that if you gave her a little time to analyze what had happened, a terrible hurricane would fall on her. "What is this? What do you mean?" Mr. Matthew came to life, expecting some kind of explanation. He had studied Emily well enough to know that a rational, logical explanation would follow. But what was it? "Who are you?" Wait, Michael bent his eyebrows. "Do you realize you're derailing a major deal? You're not going to get away with this." She didn't care about anyone else in the room. She was only addressing Mr. Matthew. Still clutching the two halves of the torn documents tightly, choking on her words, she tried to summarize the situation, to quickly recount the conversation she had overheard between the two lovers. She had to hurry. Now she would be interrupted, and that would be the end of it. Except that, to Emily's surprise, and the notary's, the patient's legal spouse froze with shock and surprise. It was too sudden a denouement. They probably didn't realize in their worst nightmare that someone had found out about their plans. "I understood that your will didn't leave anything to Mrs. Chloe," Emily finished as convincingly as she could. so she slipped you a deed of gift to grab the business and property in advance. Mrs. Chloe couldn't bear it. She walked straight at Emily, glaring at her with rage boiling inside her, shouting, "Give me the papers at once. What nonsense is this? You idiot." Except Emily had no intention of giving up. She'd been given a head start by letting her talk. Now she had to convince the patient. The old man's eyes couldn't tell who he believed. He didn't say anything out loud either. The carer went all in. "Mrs. Chloe, I won't give you back for anything. Mr. Matthew, hold this. Don't give it to them. Just a minute, please. I'll find your normal glasses with your diopters, and you'll see for yourself." It was a real battle between two women. They knew what was at stake, and they both knew they couldn't afford to lose. On hearing Emily's proposal, Mrs. Chloe tried to lunge at her, but she had already handed the papers into her master's hands. Mr. Matthew himself was stunned. The reaction of his wife, of course, he did not like, and he firmly told his wife in a threatening tone, "You can't come near me either. Don't you try it." Turning his gaze to the nurse, he turned to her. "Well, look for your glasses. If you don't think these are right for me, I'll read everything carefully, study everything, and we'll find out by experience which of you will go away with a wolf ticket." The lovers looked at each other in horror. Mrs. Chloe's mind was clearly changing from one thought to another. She was frantically trying to work out what she should do now. She must try to get out of it. There was no help from her beau. He was as white as a sheet and shaking like a leaf. Her wife decided to appeal to her emotions. "Matthew, do you really believe that wicked girl? What nonsense is this?" Mrs. Chloe even tried to laugh, but instead of ease in her voice showed a note of hysteria. "I told you we'll find out who we can trust," her husband said in a steely voice. His tone was clearly intolerant of objection. In a few minutes, Mr. Matthew was still sitting at his desk, studying the papers. With the glasses Emily had brought him, he could see every line and every letter. That in itself was proof that she was right. When he reached about the middle of the folder, the old man stopped suddenly. Mr. Matthew had obviously found what he was looking for. He looked round at the horrified and panicked audience and threw a careless glance at Emily. "Girl, call the police." Inside, Emily was jubilant she had risked it, not for nothing. Thank God Mrs. Chloe and Andrew had finally collapsed. They realized their fate was sealed. The businessman's wife didn't want to give up so easily. She tried to say something and beg her husband, but the policeman wouldn't listen to any excuses. Mr. Matthew was literally seething with rage. Apparently the adrenaline had given him strength, and the medication had weakened him a little. The old man was steadfast and firm. All attempts of the wife to soften his fate ran into a stone wall. Even Mrs. Chloe's unsuccessful lover raised his voice. "She forced me to do it. You understand, Mr. Matthew? Mrs. Chloe forced me to commit a crime. This mean and nasty thing I didn't want to do. God knows I was against it. Only this feeble effort to get away with it was taken worse. He was now an outcast in this room, not just to two, but to three. The master looked at Michael with ill-concealed hatred. He had clearly slipped into insignificance in his eyes. All further events developed rapidly. Indeed, the police arrived. Then came even an investigator from the investigative committee, a big boss. Everyone was extremely interested in what had happened, questioned, interrogated. Emily recounted the whole story 10 times, from beginning to end, answering endless questions. The end was obvious, and in fact, joyless. The mistress of the house, already a former mistress of the house, was led out of the mansion with her lover in handcuffs. Well, Emily thought to herself, she'd said she wanted to take a chance. It hadn't worked out. Emily didn't have any schadenfreude. She was just dead tired, drained like a lemon. It's amazing. Such noise and noise, such a fight had been here just a few days ago, and now everything was quiet. I couldn't believe it. The house had returned to its former rhythm of existence, although, admittedly, the servants and all the staff breathed a sigh of relief. Gone was the oppressive atmosphere of the house, along with its former mistress. After that day, the patient never spoke to Emily again about what had happened. He was understandably distressed inside. It was a betrayal, as it seemed to him, of a kindred and close person. Mr. Matthew trusted his wife wholeheartedly, and was struggling to recover from what had happened. Emily remained silent. Why was her case small? The essence of her work had not changed. She didn't expect any gratitude. For her, the best reward was her conscience and the feeling that she had done the right thing, no matter what. Except that the rest of the house staff were gossiping, savoring the details of what had happened. It was understandable they were all getting a kick out of the landlady. After all, Mrs. Chloe was a secret tyrant. And here at last was the long-awaited act of retribution and justice. Nevertheless, Emily did not interfere in these conversations and avoided direct questions. She was not comfortable with the subject. She wanted to forget the past as soon as possible. More than a week passed before Mr. Matthews suddenly turned to her. "Emily, I keep wanting to ask you, why didn't you tell me all this before? Why did you wait?" She didn't want to deceive the old man. It was sinful. She confessed to him, "Honestly, I was afraid for myself, for the children, for my mom. I didn't know how it would turn out for me, so I kept quiet. I didn't think it was my business to meddle in other people's affairs." Mr. Matthews smiled slyly at her words. "But still, I couldn't get past someone else's misfortune." Emily only shrugged her shoulders. What could she say? She couldn't praise herself because there were still horrible scenarios in front of her eyes, where everything had gone horribly wrong, where Emily was guilty of all sins. She was just lucky. And what would have happened if luck had been on the side of Mrs. Chloe and her lover? It's frightening to imagine. With the old man, they left the subject again. Both he and she were uncomfortable remembering the past in detail again. Nothing had changed in their relations. They continued their cooperation on the same terms. Emily was also just a carer for a sick and dying old man. That suited everyone. They believed in the best. Except, unfortunately, the miracle didn't happen. Mr. Matthew passed away 2.5 months after all these events. As a medical professional, Emily understood perfectly well he was still lucky. His body was still fighting and resisting the cursed disease for a long time. But as a human being, as a woman, Emily wept sincerely for Mr. Matthew at the funeral. She had managed to become attached to the old man, even to love him. It was a sincere sentiment. Despite the expectation of an imminent end, the businessman's death still knocked the nurse out. She experienced his departure as the death of a beloved relative. A fortnight after the old man's funeral, she received a phone call. It was Mr. Matthews' trusted employee, and he stunned her by telling her that the patient had left Emily half of his fortune. From confusion and surprise, she at first took the news as a silly joke. What nonsense. It can't be, but the documents confirmed the man's words. It was exactly like that. At last, the old man decided to ennoble Emily, who did not remain indifferent, who risked herself. It was a real shock. Emily was sad and happy at the same time. It was wonderful that she could now afford to take care of her children, to provide them with a decent future and education. But what a pity for the old man. Emily prayed for Mr. Matthew every night. Her sincere gratitude knew no bounds. Amazing and incredible. You never know where you will find and where you will lose. Life is an amazing thing, no matter how you spin it.
Madeline sighed heavily. Yes, what a family the Adamses are. If I'd seen them from the outside, I'd never have realized what could be going on inside the walls of this house. There was nowhere to go. Almost all the cards had been dealt. I know who you are, you bitch. I know all about you. Name, Cynthia retorted. Her eyes were bloodshot. Her hands were fumbling around the antique table, trying to find something to throw at the villain. A bird's-eye view of the village would make you think that all the houses were printed on a huge printer. All the same similar. Brown roof screen hedges, expensive flower beds, the color of the walls. It was as if the architect, in a bad mood, had decided to make the worst plan for the village and the buildings in his life. Madeline looked at the pictures. Paradise Corner. That was the name of the village for rich people who didn't count money. But judging by what had happened there recently, it shouldn't be called that. It should be called Hell's Cauldron. Madeline Walker was a well-known detective who had solved many of the tangled stories of in town. She was not at all like a person who possessed nerves of steel and iron grip. But that was only at first glance. The girl graduated from the Pegatsaiskaya Academy in the capital of our homeland, but conquer the criminal case was not in a hurry. It is much more interesting to unravel the intricate tangle of crimes than to write off hanging sitting in the musty room cops. Madeline opened her detective agency Eagle Eye recently, helped partner Brandon, a man very stately and in love with Madeline. Of course, the girl knew it, but she had her own plans for her life. Brandon was the son of a rich banker, so he was able to rent a room and buy the necessary furniture, supplies, advertising, and a lot of nonsense, without which it is impossible to exist detective agency. Naturally, Brandon's main condition was cooperation. Madeline had to dedicate the guy in all matters relating to the investigation of cases. The girl did not like this arrangement, but if she refused, would not be a detective agency Eagle. Madeline Walker has successfully solved many cases involving robbery, child abduction, and even murder. Therefore, to the young detective quickly lined up a queue of people who could not find the truth with the help of the police. The other day, Walker received a phone call. The woman's voice in the receiver trembled. Speech was unintelligible, so Madeline politely offered to discuss everything on the spot at the agency. The client arrived the same day. She was in mourning, with a tightly tied black scarf on her head, bruises under her eyes, and a pale face. Good afternoon. My name is Jody. It was me who called you today, the woman said, blowing her nose convulsively into her handkerchief. I need your help in a very delicate case. The police, unfortunately, couldn't do it. My daughter is dead. Please accept my condolences. Madeline said quickly. She picked up a small tape recorder and turned it on. If you don't mind, I'll record our conversation so I don't miss any details. Yes, of course. Do as you please. Madeline, you're my last hope. I'm being bribed. I'm being lied to. I can't believe my little girl died of a stroke. She was so young. It's all so strange. Take your time, said Walker, fixing a stray strand of hair. Tell the story thoughtfully. Start at the beginning. Would you like some tea or coffee? Just water, Jody sobbed. Madeline poured water from a carafe and set it in front of the woman. My Kate has always been a very good girl. Jody began. She always did well in her studies. She graduated from high school with a gold medal. My husband and I decided to send her to the capital we had plenty of money. Back in the nutties, we opened our own store selling clothes from Turkey. Kate studied diligently. On weekends, she always came home. Everything was fine until she and her friend got to that unfortunate birthday party. I'll tell you more about that, Madeline said. The beginning of the story didn't sound criminal at all. Doran Smith, one of the town's bigwigs, was having a birthday party. He and his parents live in the Paradise Corner cottage community. My Kate and her friend were also invited. After that party, it was like my daughter was switched. She started dating this Doran. He turned her head. The thing is, everyone in town knows the kid's a real womanizer. He'll play around, and then he'll dump her. Kate was relentless. She loves him, that's all. I don't care if you're smashed to bits. She started disappearing to the Smith's house a lot. She was terrible with me. She came from him and quarreled with me. One day, Doreen offered Katya a place at his house, and she stupidly agreed. I never saw her alive again. Jody sobbed, her shoulders shaking. How did it happen? Did the Smiths give you any details? What was the outcome of the autopsy? Madeline asked. The story was taking a very mysterious turn. The official cause of death was a stroke. But what kind of stroke could a young, healthy girl have? My Kate was an athlete with a perfectly healthy heart. I'm sure Doreen had something to do with my little girl's death, and I want justice, Jody finished loudly. She took out her handkerchief again, wet with tears, and wiped her nose with it. Then she sipped some water from the glass and continued. The police, the Smiths, must have been bribed because they didn't consider anything other than a stroke. The case was closed. But I don't believe the official version. Help me, please, and I'll thank you well, Jody said. Walker was silent for a moment. Yes, it's an interesting case, but it was worth taking on to unravel another tangle. What if the girl did die of some other... All right, I'll take the case. I'll need all the information you have on file after the police investigation, all the references. Kate's friends and girlfriends, and half the money for my work. Madeline wrote the cost of her service on a piece of paper, and Jody nodded affirmatively. I'll see you at the agency day after tomorrow. With all the paperwork, she replied. When Jody left, Madeline quickly opened her laptop and began to look for information about the Smiths. A wealthy family, Doreen's mother and father are the founders of the bank. The son is a major who spends money left and right. And here's the mother's social media page. Margaret Smith. In the photo posed statuesque and very beautiful woman with an imperious look. It was Margot's gaze that mesmerized and frightened at the same time. Walker left the agency building well past midnight. All this time she had been making a plan of action and investigation. But all the paths led to one dead end. There are no documents on the official version of the investigation yet. We have to wait. The phone in her pocket vibrated. It was Brandon. Where do you go? The man yelled cheerfully. I just got home from work, Madeline said tiredly. What do you want? Oh, so we'll be investigating a new case soon. Brandon's voice sounded solemn. I've been waiting for you in the driveway for hours, Walker sighed. Several times a month, Brandon liked to go for a nice walk to get away from everything. He and Madeline went to the most expensive clubs and restaurants, and the guy left almost 2 months' salary of a regular accountant in those places. Oh God, today is such a day. He's going to drag me out again, Walker guessed. She had a bad headache and she wanted to sleep. Brandon, I feel so bad. It's been such a hard day, Madeline began, but the boy interrupted her. No excuses. You have to come to the club with me. Your favorite band is playing there tonight. The girl grimaced to herself. It was a good thing Brandon hadn't called via video link. He wouldn't have liked the disgruntled look on Walker's face. Okay, she said, but not for long. Dictate the address, and I'll pick you up. He mumbled satisfactorily. Morning knocked lazily on the window. Madeline got up quickly. Her head was buzzing. Last night's rest at the club had taken its toll. Brandon was lying next to her with his hands behind his head, smiling broadly. Hey, how are you? You know how to relax. You'll see later. I took a picture of you on my phone. What you did on the bar last night. Walker moaned loudly. OHHOU, I told you I can't use. It was worth it for a night like this. We didn't have anything. Madeline looked down at the blanket in horror. Thank God my pajamas were still in place. No, of course not. Brandon's eyebrows rose in surprise. Though you're attractive as hell, it would be a sin to use your body in such a deplorable state. I just took you in a cab, put you to bed, and kept watch to make sure you didn't do anything else. You bully. Brandon pecked Madeline on the cheek and went into the kitchen to find something for breakfast. Walker slowly picked up her phone, found the latest videos and photos. Oh, Brandon, that's some ready-made dirt. Here's her chasing a dancer off the pylon and trying to strip dance, and further knocking bottles off the bar with her beautiful stiletto. The last photo caught my eye. It shows Brandon, Madeline, and another guy with a girl. The young man's face looked familiar. Brandon, come here a minute. Walker called out to him. He came into the bedroom carrying a large tray. There was a glass of soda on the tray, and croissants and coffee. Mr. Antipo-Malin to the rescue. Brandon raised one fist up in a funny, heroic Brandon. Tell me, who's in this picture? Madeline put the phone in her boyfriend's hands. Oh, that's my friend Doreen Smith and his new girlfriend. You danced with him last night, too. Honey, don't you remember anything? Madeline shrugged her shoulders. Brandon, showing his perfect white teeth, laughed loudly. Her head began to buzz again. Walker rummaged through her bedside table and found an aspirin. Sipped some soda. Now we'd have to wait for the pain to go away. Then breakfast. The thing is, a woman came to see me yesterday. She's the mother of Dorian's ex-girlfriend. Her daughter died under unclear circumstances. I've decided to take over the case. You haven't heard anything about it by any chance? Wow, Brandon exhaled and rubbed his hands together. No, Madeline aspirin. I know that his ex-girlfriend's a horse's ass, but that's about it. Kate's mother's supposed to bring in the deceased's paperwork any day now. She and I have agreed on a pretty good sum for my services. I just don't know where to start. There's not a lot of information about the Smith family on social media. As a friend of Doreen's, do you have anything useful? Alas, sweetheart. The Smiths are very careful about what they show in public and what they keep in the back of the closet. Unless you live with their family, you won't be able to solve this dead girl mystery. What am I supposed to do now? Madeline became visibly sad. What would you do without me? Brandon smiled slyly. You are terribly lucky. Recently, Dimka's mother kicked out of the mansion another housekeeper. We can try to find her through a recruitment agency for rich majors, but the mistress must like you. Otherwise, your whole business will be over. Cynthia and her husband like everything neat and tidy. I was lucky enough to be in their house once. Everything was in order, not a speck of dust in. You don't think she'll realize I'm a sitting duck? Of course it's a good idea. The main thing is to get into the house, gain her trust, and then we can investigate. So what do you say? Shall we try it? Brandon asked her. He was already devouring the scones from the tray. Madeline hurried to join him. All right, but I've got to talk it over with Jody first, Walker said, and get copies of the documents. Maybe I'll find something interesting in there. My head was almost gone. The croissant smelled so appetizing that the young people ate every last one. Turns out you can be useful. Big boy, Madeline thought and smiled to herself. It didn't take long for Jody to arrive. The next day, she brought copies of all the certificates and documents to the Eagle Eye Agency. Walker, wearing her fancy gold-rimmed glasses, read the contents in detail. It's all very strange. She snapped her fingertips. Judging by the autopsy results, she should have had heart problems long ago. You say she was more than fine. Jody exclaimed. Kate never complained about her health. Did the police really get paid? And how much money did it take to get the honest justice officials to cover up a sensitive case? Thought Walker. Madeline initiated the woman into her future plans. Jody was surprised and dumbfounded by this turn of events, but Walker assured her that everything should go well, Madeline said. And Jody breathed a sigh of relief. If I get into the settlement, you and I probably won't be able to see each other very often. Whether the Smith family's phone calls are monitored is also a mystery. Wait for my call. Don't call me yourself. If anything, I don't know you. You've never met me. Jody nodded affirmatively. The next morning, an excited Brandon was ringing Madeline's doorbell. I've made an appointment with the secretary of the Lily of the Valley. That's where Cynthia recruits most of her staff, he said as Walker poured coffee into cups. She was preoccupied with something, and the boy noticed it. What if something goes wrong? What if they find out I'm not who I say I am? Don't pretend to be. Don't worry, I'll try to visit Dimka more often to make sure you're safe. Remember, the most important thing is that all the household believes that you are a real housekeeper with experience. Pack your bags, no time to waste, or they'll hire someone else to take your place. Brandon helped Madeline to pack everything she needed, quickly packed a suitcase in the trunk of his foreign car, and they rushed down the busy road. The Lily of the Valley Agency was one of the most elite places to hire a maid with a lot of experience and specialized training. Brandon handed Madeline a fake certificate of completion of a housewife's course and references from a previous job. Study this thoroughly so you won't get into any trouble when the landlady asks, he advised. But how did you? Don't ask. Moore smiled Brandon. EI promised the pretty secretary a wonderful evening at the swankiest restaurant in town. So you owe me. The boy winked. Madeline raised her eyebrows in surprise. Sometimes Brandon can be quite the help. She thought and started reading her resume. O.B. Garrison, born in 1991, graduated from special education in Washington, D.C., was a housekeeper for a family. Everything swam in front of her eyes. She's O.B. Garrison now. That's great. I have to learn to respond to that name so they don't notice the switch. Where is O.B. now? She asked Brandon thoughtfully. She went to her relatives in TV and got pregnant by her master. So the case was hushed up and she was sent away, so as not to spoil the reputation of the rich family. Madeline shuddered. Not a good start, but a detective should be able to do everything, even work under someone else's name. She'd promised Jean she'd find the truth. All right, Obie, are you ready? Did you read the questionnaire? Cynthia's gonna be here any minute. You're gonna have to do something to make her choose you. Madeline asked, are there any other candidates? Of course. Ain't answered Brandon. You have 5 more charming young girls. I suggest you change into a more modest outfit. and put your hair in a tight bun Cynthia likes order. Madeline quickly changed her clothes and did as the boy advised. Half an hour later, the rich mistress was already at the agency. Cynthia changed housekeepers like gloves, so the other girls said. Madeline's heart dropped. Come on, think of something to make her hire you. She screamed inside. The secretary of the Lily of the Valley agency asked the girls to line up in a straight line. When the woman entered the room, Madeline knew at a glance who she was. Cynthia, tall and slender, had a commanding and magnetic look. Her voice was loud and commanding. She stopped in front of the potential housekeepers and asked the receptionist for all the girls' resumes. Cynthia studied the papers for a long time, then looked up sharply and said, I've chosen. Who is Monica Wiggins? That's it. That's it. What am I supposed to do? Madeline's eyes raced. I've got it, Cynthia. May I speak to you? You're making a big mistake hiring that housekeeper. Walker stepped forward and continued. I used to work in the same big mansion with Sidorova. I'll tell you, she's been stealing groceries and taking them out of the village more than once. The girls gasped and whispered. And Sidorova, white with anger, cried out, She's lying. I didn't steal anything. I have an excellent reputation, but Cynthia paid no attention to Monica. Her scrutinizing gaze rested on Madeline. Are you Harrison? I've never seen you in this agency before. And you look better than the others. Okay, you'll work for me. We'll see what happens. Maybe you're the one stealing, and you're the one who told on your friend. Cynthia smiled broadly, revealing large white teeth. Monica whispered curses, but Walker didn't care. Her plan had come to fruition. Now the main thing was not to give herself away. The hostess talked to the secretary for a few more minutes, then nodded to Madeline and headed for the exit. Walker, showing her tongue to the other girls, quickly picked up her heavy suitcase and followed Cynthia. A luxury car of the latest model was waiting for her at the exit. Madeline was about to open the doors, but Cynthia stopped her with a wave of her hand. You're taking a different car. The servants aren't allowed to ride with the owners. The exception is our... You can't say anything, Madeline thought, and looked around. Obie Harrison, was being called by a handsome man. Madeline drove to the Paradise Corner settlement in a domestically made ramshackle car. My name is Reese. The man introduced himself, looking at Madeline in the rearview mirror. It's nice to see new faces in our home. I hope you're familiar with our hostess's personality. UAC sharp. OBI, replied the girl. UA judging by her appearance. She is very... You're right. Reese winked. I'd advise you not to fall for her son. If you go missing, your family won't find you. He was suddenly silent, and they rode in silence the rest of the way. Paradise Corner was closely guarded. You couldn't just walk through. A wide and long fence led along the entire territory of the cottage village. At the entrance were 2 guards in full armor. Madeline memorized everything carefully. Wow, you've got a lot of security here, she said to Reese. He nodded affirmatively. The villagers don't like uninvited guests. Every visitor is registered in a book. The guards have the book, so don't try to escape. They won't let you out that easily. Reese smiled, and Madeline didn't know if he was joking or telling the truth. But the whole thing is creepy. The house stopped in the backyard of a posh mansion. The house looked like an old castle. Tall towers, peculiar masonry walls. Madeline froze for a moment at the entrance. The house amazed her. She had only seen such buildings in pictures of children's fairy tales. Reese gently pushed Madeline toward the entrance and wished her good luck. Walker hesitantly entered the building. How chic and expensive everything was. What a huge kitchen. Marble floors, mirrored ceilings. Suddenly, a strong hand grabbed her shoulder. Cynthia. The woman led Madeline into the parlor, where the rest of the servants were already lined up. Walker scrutinized the even formation of 2 guards, 3 drivers, a fat cook, a laundress, and a housekeeper. A Wiccan wore the same uniform, a white bonnet, a dark brown dress with a sheer lace apron. On their feet were black patent shoes without heels. The guards and drivers wore blue overalls and the same patent shoes. All looked sternly downward, hesitating to raise their eyes to the hostess and the new girl. And Cynthia, smiling contentedly, introduced Madeline. Honored ones. There's a new member of your friendly staff today. Please love and welcome Obie Garrison. She'll be replacing our previous housekeeper. Yeah, sure. And Dimitri's gonna have some fun too. Fresh meat, the sullen cook muttered. Everyone nodded their heads. So, you know very well that such talk will get you fired without reinstatement. Cynthia's voice suddenly changed from honey-colored to dry and commanding. Peggy, will you come to my office after lunch? Cynthia said, glaring at the cook. Peggy seemed to realize what the management was going to talk to her about, so she quickly squared her head and looked down at the floor. Madeline looked around curiously at the staff. The guards were all well-built, pumped up, slim and stern. The cook and laundress were like twins, equally plump, with kind eyes. The housekeeper is like an old mantis, a dried-up and decrepit woman on the threshold of old age. But the housekeeper's unkind look did not please the girl. Please show Obi to her room. Cynthia said to the housekeeper. Give her the linens and tell her duties. Obi, when you've laid out your things and changed into your uniform, come and see me to discuss your salary. But my salary was already set at the agency where you hired me, Walker wondered. There's something, of course, Cynthia said wryly. But we haven't talked about additional services. Don't waste time. Go to your room and get changed. Muse, take her upstairs. Cynthia waved to the rest of the staff, a gesture that obviously meant the introductions were over. Seems like getting acquainted and figuring things out here is going to be very difficult. Well, nothing. We'll see, thought Madeline as she climbed the steep spiral staircase upstairs. The muse showed the girl to her small room. It was more like a closet because it was in the attic part of the house. There was an old iron bed, a chest of drawers, and a desk with a chair by the window. Nothing else. You can stay here, Obi. Martha said politely, pointing to the bed. And the laundress will bring your laundry. Keep it clean and change it as needed. You will ask our hostess any questions you may have when you're clean. We say, Muse, I don't know your middle name. Muse Scott. I'll say, Muse Scott. Is it customary here to address a stranger as you? The old housekeeper pressed her lips together. You know, Obi, only the strongest of spirits endure here. Cynthia is a very wise woman, and she keeps only a select few around her. I've served her faithfully for over 15 years, and in all that time, she has never questioned my courtesy or the proper treatment of her servants. Not once has she ever punished me. So, girl, it's not for you to tell me how to treat anyone. Muse Scott turned abruptly and disappeared out the door. Madeline stood with the suitcase by the dresser. Oh, wow. She said to herself, what a place to live. When she had laid out her things and made her bed, she put on the uniform that the courteous washerwoman had brought her. Without a word, the woman placed the clothes on the bed, nodded, and disappeared like a shadow. The servants here walked silently. That meant that anything could definitely happen in this mansion. Insidious scheming, deceit, treason, and murder. Maybe more than one. Like, where did the old housekeeper go? So, Obi, how do you like our house? Thanks, but I've only been in my room so far. But I'm sure it's gorgeous and very old. Yes, it's beautiful. It used to belong to my great-grandmother. During World War II, the Nazis took it over, but after the German army was defeated, the house survived. I didn't invite you into my office to discuss your job duties. You already know them. Madeline knew them. To keep the house clean, to clean the household, to set the table before meals, to serve the mistress and her family. By the way, where's Cynthia and Dorian's husband? You probably know that we are the owners of a huge inheritance. We keep our valuables safe and don't show our lives to the common people. Jetty, Cynthia began. Her voice sounded assertive. That's why you should know that any gossip about our family is a direct way to be reprimanded and fired. All phone calls are tapped, keep that in mind. In general, anything you see or hear here must stay within the walls of the house. Now about the business. I wanted to offer you an extra income. You will have to inform about the condition of all my subordinates. Are you suggesting that I snitch on my co-workers? The girl asked bluntly. Why are you being so harsh? The hostess smiled wryly. Not to snitch, but to share the mood of the staff with me. I should know what's being said behind my back. Of course. You just want me to be a snitch. You sly toad, Walker thought, and answered, Am I allowed to think? Of course, Cynthia said. I didn't expect such a quick answer. Think it over, and then you and I will make a deal, Smith smiled. But Madeline saw something devilish and unkind in that smile. Now you may begin your duties. Go to Muse Scott and get what you need for your work." When Madeline left, Cynthia exhaled deeply and said to herself, "Either she's stupid or she's too smart. It's okay, Obi, I'll find out who you really are." Brandon called her at midnight. He promised he'd come to visit Beatrice soon. Dorian Smith arrived home late. He was drunk. Dorian's father showed up after midnight. Madeline heard Cynthia screaming and cursing. The tired girl fell asleep in the morning. "Meh. Peggy, what's the matter?" Kagia yelled, "You've overdried the meat again. Maybe it's time to replace you. Get out of my sight, you brainless bitch." Peggy picked up the pieces of roast that were lying on the floor, picked up a tray, and whirled out of the dining room. Doreen chuckled at the sight of such a scene. He obviously found this morning's squabble funny. He looked at Madeline and his eyes lit up. Vincent, Cynthia's husband, sniffled unhappily as he looked at his wife. "Oh, honey, can't you get off your butt sometimes and cook something yourself?" He asked his wife calmly. "No, Daddy, she can't. Mom's too busy lying on the couch." Oh, Cynthia pounded her fist on the table. "Hey, son, you know that. I'm sick right now." "Mom, you're always sick." "Well, I'm going to go. Wait for us to visit tonight." The hostess changed her face. "You asked who? Who else are you going to bring?" Doreen was very much like his mother. That's why he liked to annoy her. His new girlfriend. "You don't dare bring your new prostitute here." Her mother shrieked and her hands shook. Vincent tried to calm her down, but it was in vain. "I dare you. You've got the old one down, but you wouldn't dare treat the new one like that." "Believe me." Doreen finished his coffee and left the dining room. Madeline looked up at him curiously as she cleaned up the grease from the roast. What was he talking about? Who was swatting who? Doreen winked at her and slammed the front door. There was the sound of a car engine slowly moving away. Darling, Cynthia sobbed. I can't go on like this. Sweetheart, let's go to the bedroom. I'll give you something to calm you down." Vincent took his wife under his arm and they went into one of the back rooms. When Cynthia's husband came out, Madeline was cleaning the hallway. "You didn't hear anything this morning. Do you understand me?" He hissed, looking Madeline in the eye. She invited not to argue. "Oh, of course, Vincent. I didn't hear anything. Everything was fine. You had breakfast and went about your business?" "Oh, good girl," growled the satisfied host. He got dressed and left for work. Walker had been working at the Smith house for 2 months. In that time, she had gotten to know the rest of the servants. Muse Scott, a stern-looking housekeeper, turned out to be a very simple-minded woman. She liked the outdoors, and Madeline often asked to go for walks in the park with her. "You know, I don't have a mother. You look just like her," Madeline sobbed, and Muse Scott's heart melted. She became more attached to the housekeeper, and Madeline could thus learn all the information about the Smith family members. Peggy, a longtime cook, had disliked Madeline from the first day. Walker recognized the woman's weak spot. Peggy liked expensive alcohol. Therefore, the girl, in one of the cloudy evenings, visited the room where the cook lived and treated her with expensive cognac. The brandy was brought by Madeline Brandon. The plump cook told Walker that strange things were happening in the mansion. All of Doreen's girls are dying in a strange way, of heart attacks, but Peggy didn't believe it. She thought that the girls are killed by the son of the mistress himself, and the mother and father cover up the atrocities of their child. Madeline decided to herself that Peggy was the main ear of the house, so the cook must always be kept on the hook. The fat and pitiful laundress, Maiji, worked in the basement and rarely came out. Madeline had a bad rapport with her, but she knew from Peggy Walker that Mary had a daughter and had worked in the house before. Then she had died under strange circumstances. Meiji was quiet and didn't share her life story with the guards. Had little interest in Madeline, but Walker knew they were probably the main witnesses who might know the truth about what was happening to the girls in the mansion. There would have to be a clever way to collect the camera footage. One of the men, Daniel, was younger than the others. He could be approached. How Walker hadn't figured out yet. The drivers, Ireland and Wendy Whitewater, were twins, and Madeline often confused. Brandon began coming to the Smith house more often, and he and Doreen would play pool or watch movie premieres. He and Madeline learned to communicate on the phone with the help of a special cipher. Some words were replaced by others, but the meaning of the information could be grasped. Brandon, in turn, was interested in the affairs and life of Doreen. Madeline never agreed to Cynthia's additional income. The landlady did not appreciate such a decision. From the servants, Walker learned that the mistress gave such an offer to each of the workers of the house, but no one dared to take such a step. Whistleblowers are not liked. Snitches are quietly put away. Every day of her life in the Smith house, the detective recorded on a small dictaphone. It was necessary to filter information and memorize every little thing. Also, the cunning housekeeper was able to install several tiny recording cameras when she cleaned the rooms of the owners and doors. The main thing was to make sure that no one noticed the peepholes. The first plans had come to fruition. Now it was necessary to gain the trust of the young guard. Madeline's thoughts were interrupted by loud laughter. Doreen walked into the hallway, holding the hand of a young girl. She was dressed in an expensive mink coat and leather boots. Madeline had a good eye for quality things. "Oh, hello, Annie." Doreen waved cheerfully. Get the table ready. I'm going to introduce Mom and Dad to my future wife." Madeline smelled the odor of alcohol coming from the boy. "You've got to keep your eyes open now." Cynthia slowly entered the hallway. Her head was covered with a tight towel, for she had been unwell all day. Vincent had returned from work early today and was sitting in his study, but the shouting and noise in the hallway forced his master to come downstairs. "Dory, what are you doing here?" he asked, sighing noisily. "Mother's been in bed with headaches since this morning. Take the young lady home and we'll get acquainted tomorrow." I wouldn't think of it." Doran shouted cheerfully. If you don't want to get acquainted today, the young lady will sleep at our house and we'll get acquainted at breakfast." She smiled politely at Cynthia and Vincent Taylor. The host looked at Madeline with a murderous look, and she realized what she had to do. "OBA, tell Peggy not to put alcohol on the table." Cynthia whispered to Madeline, "Tell Peggy to put more alcohol on the table. We're having a party tonight. Right, honey?" The girl smiled fearfully and nodded. Cynthia motioned to go into the dining room. The woman was pale and often clung to her temples. Vincent sat down at the head of the table with a stone face. The newcomer was not welcome in this house. Madeline was carrying the dishes and overhearing the Smiths' conversation. Honey, don't worry. We'll get her out of here in no time." Vincent whispered to It's not the way I'd like it to be today. I don't think I'll survive 1 minute with that prostitute." Cynthia hissed. Where did he pick her up? Or Doreen, red with either joy or drink, tended to his girlfriend in the hallway. Madeline helped him hang up his clothes. Doreen's new fling was very pretty and sophisticated. I wouldn't have thought she looked like a girl of easy virtue. Probably a person of high society. Doreen's girlfriend, maybe. Madeline took out her tape recorder and quietly placed it on the mantel, covering it with a framed photograph. Okay, great. Now we don't have to worry about any information floating past our ears. Meanwhile, dinner was served and everyone gathered around the table. Madeline stood a little farther back behind her host's backs to carry the dirty plates into the kitchen. "Mommy." Doreen began, "My dear, let me introduce you to my new wife-to-be. Her name is Lexi. She's very rich, so can you please leave your barbs behind and accept my choice for once in your life?" Lexi's was obviously feeling a little out of place. She blushed thickly and looked at Doreen expressively. But he continued as if nothing had happened. "Oh, Mother, she's going to live with us. Since I am the heir to this house, I have the right to decide who lives here. Daddy, you won't let Mom hurt my fiancé, will you? Like she did to Kate?" "Shut up," Vincent yelled. His face darkened and he slammed the plate down hard. It shattered and fell to the floor. Madeline hurried to pick up the pieces. Whoa, things are starting to take a turn for the worse. Jody, Kate's mother, thinks her daughter was killed by Doreen, but maybe there's more to it than meets the eye. "Dad, don't scare Lexi." Doreen began in a hurt tone, "But my son, you're scaring your fiancé. Why would she tell you about your ex-girlfriend, who didn't lead a very decent life, cheating on you with a security guard? Lexi comes from a very intelligent and respectable family. Honey, have dinner with us." Cynthia, with an anaconda's gaze, began to put meat and potatoes on her guest's plate. "Lexi, thank you, Cynthia, but I don't eat that much. I'm watching my figure. Doreen doesn't like fat people." Cynthia smiled wryly and whispered to Madeline, "Go to Peggy's kitchen and help her decorate the dessert." It's clear. The hostess doesn't want any extra ears in the dining room. Madeline smiled and went out. The dictaphone will record everything. It was hot in the kitchen. Peggy was sitting at the table drinking tea. Did you bring another victim? The woman grinned. Do you want tea? Cynthia sent me to help decorate the dessert, Madeline said. Peggy raised an eyebrow in surprise. Oh, it's been done for a long time. Come sit down and we'll talk. Madeline sat down at the table. Peggy began. She came to change the linen in your room and found something. The woman held out her palm to Madeline. There was a bug on the palm, apparently lost when Walker pulled out the baggie with the tiny cameras. How could she be so sloppy? But I had to find a way out of it. I don't know. Probably a camera, Madeline shrugged. But Peggy continued her questioning. Oh, I can see it's a spy camera. How did it get in your room? Oh, I guess the owners wanted to test my honesty, so they put it there. Walker tried to evade. Do you think I'm a fool, girl? The cook smiled. I can see from your face that you're not a housekeeper for hire. You don't know how to clean professionally. You don't know how to serve the owners. Who are you and where did you come from? Tell me, or I'll have to tell my guesses to the owners. Peggy poured herself more tea and looked questioningly at Walker. What's to be done? How could I have blundered like this? Because of my busy work schedule, I forgot to change the laundry myself. What else could the laundress have seen in there? Madeline pondered chaotically, but there was nowhere to go. Peggy could really tell the owners, and then the whole plan would fail. We have to tell the truth. Yes, you're right. Walker said after a moment. I'm not who I say I am, but I didn't get here by accident. I'm investigating the mysterious death of Kate, Doreen's ex-girlfriend. She recently passed away right here in the house. The girl's mother doesn't believe Kate could have died of a stroke. Her daughter was perfectly healthy, and my name isn't Obi. It's Madeline. Madeline walked. Wow, Peggy whistled. Why didn't you tell me about yourself before? Madeline looked at the woman in surprise. Logic was definitely not Peggy's strong suit. I didn't know anything about you. You could have turned me in, and then I would never have known the truth about the murder. The cook looked at Madeline very carefully, questioning whether or not to believe the story. Suddenly, she said excitedly, Walker, I know you. I've heard about your agency many times. Brendan, Doreen. Madeline nodded in agreement. Yes, Brendan and I have decided that I need to infiltrate the Smith mansion itself and find out all the facts. I need all the security tapes. Maybe they have Kate's murder on them, but there's no way I can gain the trust of any of them. I've known Cynthia and her husband for years. They could be hiding their son's evil deeds. Doreen's strange too, changing girls like a glove. How many girls has the Smith son had, and all of them disappearing in the middle of nowhere? Or fuck off, Peggy exclaimed delightedly, but Madeline shushed her. The Smiths might have heard. Peggy, you must promise me you won't tell anyone. Not about me and my business. Not even the washerwoman. No one but us can know who I really am. Swear it. Come on, darling. I'll never give you up. I promise to help you with your case. I too feel sorry for all the girls of that young tyrant. There were so many of them, all from rich families. Where they disappeared to, I don't know, but Cynthia never accepted any potential bride into her family. Just the air in the dining room was tense. Lightning seemed to fly from Cynthia's eyes. Vincent stared blankly at the ceiling. The girl served dessert. She managed to sneak over to the fireplace and took out a tape recorder. She wondered what they were talking about. When dinner was over, Madeline quickly cleaned up the dining room and hurried to her room. In her hand, she clutched the dictaphone. But when the girl entered the bedroom, she shrieked in surprise. On the bed sat Doreen. Hello, little birdie, he said and smiled. Madeline froze at the door. What was he doing here? After all, the girl had seen with her own eyes how he, along with Lexi, had gone to his apartment. What does he want? Don't shake. I came to you with an offer. You see, my mother is in a bad mood about my new girlfriend again. I'll make you a deal. You tell me everything you hear about me and Lexi from my parents, and I'll pay you good money. Deal. Madeline sighed. Mother and son are the same, and if Cynthia finds out, she won't. Dory moved closer to Madeline and patted the girl on the cheek. If you don't tell, I hope you're smart. I am a grave. It's not in my interest to spoil myself in the mansion. All right, I'll give it a try. Yue Walker sighed. How just in time is all this? Doreen winked happily and quickly left the bedroom. The girl closed the door tightly, lay down with her head under the blanket, and turned on the recorder. Doreen EK, how nice of you to bring such a young lady into the house again. Lexi, do you like it here? Your pants aren't too tight after dinner. Cynthia's voice sounded. I'm fine, thank you. Lexi answered confidently and without a tremor in her voice. I really like your cozy home. I live downtown and this cottage community is my first time in this area. Your house really stands out from the others. I hope when you come to my parents' house to meet them, you'll appreciate our mansion too. Oh, honey, I hope that won't happen. It was the landlady again. Her voice was lusciously, Mommy, take it easy. If you want to see your little boy home once in a while, don't make me have to pack my bags and leave home again. The recorder was silent for a minute. Then there was a sob. Doreen, don't say that. Let Lexi stay with us as long as she wants. You just, okay, Mommy, calm down. I'm not going anywhere. Dad, we'll probably go to our place. Cynthia shakes. Stop it, sweetheart. I hate her already. If you only knew. I hate all of them. They want to take everything from Doreen. And our money. My dear, come on. I'll give you a pill. Footsteps sounded, and the recorder turned off. So much for the recording, Madeline thought for a moment. Strange. Cynthia has strong nerves, but something had clearly happened at dinner that had thrown the mistress of the mansion off balance. We must get to the bottom of this, only very carefully. There was a persistent knock at the door. Madeline wasn't expecting anyone. Who? Open up, Madeline. It's Peggy. Walker let the woman into the room and locked the door. Peggy, please don't shout my name all over the floor. They could hear you. The girl shouted angrily. I'm sorry. I'm stupid. The woman whimpered. I have a plan to get the security tapes. The whole house. HSDNT. Ow, come on, tell me. Peggy took Madeline's hands. It's simple. Daniel, one of the guards, is head over heels in love with you. He confessed it to me the other day when he was having lunch in the kitchen. He's been asking me all sorts of questions about how to approach you. This is our chance. Just reciprocate. Madeline sighed and sat down on the bed. Playing with love is no joke. It could end very sadly, but it was worth a try. It was a magical winter morning. The first thin snow fell and covered the frozen ground with its lace. The spirit of the upcoming new year was in the sky. City Paradise Corner was slowly being dressed up. In some houses, the workers were already working at full speed. They put on the roofs and walls of houses LED ribbons, installed figures of snowmen, Santa Claus. The Smith mansion already stood dressed up. The towers were decorated with lights on the windows, elegant lace patterns made of special paper. Madeline took an active part in all this pre-holiday bustle and even for a moment forgot that she was a detective under a false name. During this time, the Smith house had become her home. Madeline had been nursing the idea of a relationship for a long time, until one day Daniel himself talked to the girl when they went to town to buy groceries. The housekeeper was contractually obligated to go shopping with an escort. The guard had apparently asked for it. Nice weather, isn't it? He asked, looking in the rearview mirror. Madeline looked straight into the guy's eyes. They were like two hypnotic circles, drawing him inward. Oh, great. I love winter. The girl answered honestly. The driver, Edgar Stanley, smiled slyly. He switched the wave on the radio. You're not like the other housekeepers were. Daniel was still looking thoughtfully in the mirror. There's something special about you. Yeah, of course there is. I'm just not who I think I am, that's all. Big deal. Madeline's heart was aflame. He answered aloud. I don't know any former housekeepers, but I can tell you that I'm not very good at cleaning. Daniel smiled. They drove the rest of the way to the center in complete silence. Only the music from the stereo disturbed the peace. Edgar Stanley lit a cigarette and opened the window a little. A stream of cool but refreshing air rushed. Madeline sighed with pleasure. Daniel glanced at the girl the whole way. At the center, all the Paradise Corner housekeepers bought their groceries from only one single high-end store, Adam and Eve. The first time Madeline saw the sign, she laughed heartily. How had she never noticed this storefront before? After all, she'd been to the market 1,000 times. And to miss such a name, I wonder who had gotten the idea. Poor Adam and Eve would have rolled over in their graves for the 1,000th time. But today Madeline didn't even look at the sign. She stared into the crowd. Oh no! Jody was staring at her. Now she was going to give Walker away. Jody waved her arms at Madeline. "Who's that?" "Someone you know," Danielle asked sympathetically. Madeline begged Jody with one eye, "Please don't say my name. Just walk past me, please." The woman caught Walker's pleading gaze, nodded affably to the guard, and disappeared into the crowd. Madeline exhaled loudly. "Whew, she almost got hooked like a huge fish. Gotta be more careful." Daniel said to hurry up, and they entered the Adam and Eve store. Wandering by the grocery shelves, Madeline kept feeling Daniel's breath on her neck. It was time for this to stop. The girl turned around abruptly. She met the boy's eyes and read the devotion and love in them. "Shall we go for a walk in the park tonight? When we finish our work?" The boy murmured. "I don't mind." Madeline replied politely. She didn't want to cheat the guard's feelings, but sacrifices had to be made for the cause. If she pretended to be in love, she would have access to all the information she needed. First finds a Daniel smiled and took Madeline's hand. "That's so cute, just like high school." Walker's first love had been just as naive. Her classmate had been hesitant to approach Madeline, but she was the first to tell him how she felt. And as in all the famous fairy tales, all should have lived happily ever after, but not so. Turns out a classmate had bet his friend to win Madeline over. Oh, she cried so hard. Apparently, the first unhappy love left its bitter traces in Walker's soul. She could not meet anyone for more than 6 months. Now it's a relationship game. In the evening, Daniel was waiting for the girl at the entrance. He was holding a modest bouquet of roses. The flowers gave off a great fragrance. Strangely, the roses were not like the ones sold in flower stores. They didn't smell so strong. Cynthia grows these flowers herself. She was kind enough to cut a few sprigs for me. "Here you go," Danielle said happily. "Thank you," replied Madeline, who was blushing. They walked slowly down the path to the park. "Danielle, I'm sorry to be blunt, but I don't quite understand what's going on at the mansion." Cynthia and Vincent seemed like a very intelligent couple at first, until I met their son, Doreen. It's like he's deliberately pissing off his parent. Why would he do that? Doreen has nothing to spare. Fly to the islands, buy all the fancy cars in town. He's got the girls all ready to fall at his feet. "You were looking at him too," Daniel said. "It's my job to keep an eye on everyone." "Well, you've been watching him, and he sees that and he's flirting. Aren't you afraid of being in the shoes of all the other girls?" The guard's words startled Walker. "What does he mean?" "No, you're imagining things. I look at everyone like that," Madeline mumbled, trying to change this. The rest of the walk they talked about unimportant things. Their plans for New Year's Eve, their hobbies. Madeline found it hard to make up Obi's story. I wonder how the young man would behave if he found out that it was not Obi's housekeeper, but young Detective Madeline Walker. Probably ratted out the landlady. Daniel led Madeline to the front of the mansion and said goodbye. "Would you like me to show you where I live and work next time?" he asked. Bingo. I didn't even have to make up an excuse to get into his den and see where the hard disks were and stealthily take them, and then find a place where you can rewrite the information to disk. "That would be great," the girl replied. She let Daniel kiss her cheek. Madeline went into her bedroom and laid her head on her pillow tiredly. Then she dialed Brandon's number. "Hello, Madeline. Is that you?" A voice mumbled sleepily. "You see what time it is?" "My, Brandon, the bird is almost in the cage," said the girl. "We need a few more days and we will catch it." The voice on the other end of the line said, "Good for you," she said. "Call me if you need anything." Madeline hung up the phone and was about to doze off, but her peace was interrupted by shrieks downstairs. "You bastard, how dare you!" Cynthia screamed in a fit. She was in her pink nightdress, her bonnet pulled down over her hair. The landlady's face was blue from screaming. Vincent held Cynthia, preventing her from attacking Lexi. Michi stood nearby. "I won't let you hurt the girl." The laundress said in a trembling voice and covered the girl with her body. Vitally, "Let me go. I'll show her now." "Where did you take my son, you bitch?" Why, Lexi sobbed and hid behind the laundress' broad back. Madeline could see Peggy's worried face through the narrow slit of the door. "Okay?" The landlady yelled next. "Get the hell out of my house. Stop wasting my money. Don't ever set foot here again. I'll give you 1 minute." She's not going anywhere. said Michi sharply. Your son has knocked up the poor girl. She's pregnant. It's your son who should be kicked out. He should not spoil any more young girls. How much longer are you going to abuse? You know I won't have to tell the police what you did to your son's previous girlfriend. Get out. Cynthia shouted. The door of the mansion opened abruptly. Doreen flew in. Surprisingly, he was sober. Madeline felt as if she had to stop him. She put her arm around Cynthia. Doreen, calm down. But the guy didn't hear her. He shoved Madeline roughly away, causing her to fall to the floor and hurt. All she remembered was Peggy's tear-stained face and Daniel's eyes, then darkness. Madeline woke up in her room with her head tightly bandaged. Muse Scott was sitting beside her. Lie down, my good girl. She said, adjusting the blanket. You need to rest. You hit your head hard on the sharp corner of the stairs, but you're all right now. They called a doctor and he stitched up your head. Just lie down and rest. If you need anything, call me on the phone. I'll be right over. What about the others? Madeline interrupted her. She felt the bump on her head and wrinkled her nose. Where are Doreen and Lexi? Cynthia? Miji? Cynthia's in her room with her husband. Thank goodness that you fell and passed out. It stopped the family fight. I don't know what would have happened if that hadn't happened. Doreen and Lexi are in their wing. Of course, I'm in shock that she's in the position. What's going to happen now? And Miji? What about her? Muse Scott lowered her gaze. The laundress, unfortunately, was kicked out immediately. They wouldn't even let her pack her bags. Now you're the one who has to stand up for yourself. You should have used your head. Oh, that's terrible. She was protecting Lexi. Cynthia could have hit that girl. Honey, the old housekeeper interrupted her, but it's happened here sometimes. This is not an isolated incident. You'd better not get involved in this case. Muse Scott, please tell me what happened to Kate, Doreen's ex-girlfriend. Madeline held the housekeeper's hand to keep her from leaving. She's dead, Muse Scott said through gritted teeth. I don't believe it. You're lying to me. Tell me the truth. Walker screamed. She squeezed the housekeeper's fingers tightly. Obi, calm down. The woman pulled her hand out of Walker's iron fetters and rubbed it. Cynthia said, you're on sick leave for a week. Peggy can take care of 2. I'll do the laundry. When you go back to work, you'll have to do the laundry. I've got enough to do around the house. Muse Scott's gone. Oh no, a week just wasted. And not to know what would happen next after the family quarrel. Madeline tried to get out of bed, but immediately fell backwards. A sharp headache pierced her skull. The girl fell into a short, dreamless sleep. The next morning, Peggy came in to see Walker. Looking at the cook's puffy face, Madeline realized that Peggy was grieving for her colleague. I see you're all right. How's your head? Does it hurt? The woman hugged Madeline. Don't worry, I'm on the mend, and I'll be back to work soon. Walker smiled happily. It's been like that. Peggy said. The landlady almost killed the poor girl. You should have seen the look on Doreen's face. He must have fallen head over heels in love with Lexi. Anyway, they're getting married and Cynthia's not happy about it. She's locked herself in her room, and sometimes I bring her food, but she won't touch it. What's going to happen next? I don't want it to be like Kate, Madeline said and closed her eyes. Biggie, I need to get better. Daniel's been asking for you. Can he come over for a few minutes? He's worried, poor guy. Madeline nodded affirmatively. We have to keep investigating, no matter what, and get out of this house while the bones are still intact. A week later, Madeline went back to her job. Now she had to do laundry for extra pay. But the girl was not afraid of hardship. While you work, you have more time to think. The guard promised to show her his workplace. Well, she would get there today. Madeline found Daniel in the backyard of the repair shop. He was lying under a car in a t-shirt, fixing something. What are you doing here? She exclaimed in surprise. Daniel climbed out from under the car and kissed Madeline on the cheek. Well, now I'm not only a guard, but also a driver. Miji left and led Edgar away with her. They had been in love for a long time. I'm sorry, Madeline replied inside. And now I'm not only a housekeeper, but also a laundress. Listen, do you know? I think Monica had a daughter who worked here. What happened to her? The laundress told me her daughter disappeared. Her daughter's name was Obi. She did work here, but I never saw her. Edgar Stanley told me everything. Miji had arranged for Obi to be her assistant. 20-year-old girl changed the linens and brought them to the laundress. The landlady's son had taken a liking to her. I think they even met in the backyard. But then Obi disappeared. Midgie was very sad. She searched for her daughter for a long time, but there were no leads. They say the washerwoman even wandered into the woods near our village. What is unusual about this forest? Walker asked curiously. Daniel wrinkled his nose as if he was remembering. They say the forest is enchanted, that if you go in there, you'll disappear without a trace. Sometimes they hear screaming and crying, the souls of lost people trying to find their way to paradise. Marnie laughed. Danielle, you're wonderful. I've never laughed so hard in my life. I'm sorry, but that's crazy. You still believe in spirits and enchanted forests. There's just animals out there, maybe even wolves. That's why they howl. Think what you want. Danielle looked at the girl piercingly. But I believe in otherworldly forces, and in God and spirits. Okay, I won't argue with you. Stubborn sheep, Madeline thought to herself. You promised me you'd show me the place where you work. Walker smiled. Daniel agreed. He took a shower, changed into his usual security guard uniform, and led the girl to a one-story gray building that was a little to the left of the Smith mansion. There were many rooms in the building. Some of them were living rooms with bunks and desks. Others were. Madeline caught one eye in the room where the monitor stood. Oh, how interesting. Let's go in here. She clapped her hands childishly. The young man frowned. But what could he do if a pretty girl agreed to his proposal? Daniel, come on in. Madeline was the first to enter the den. It turned out that the surveillance cameras were not only outside, but also in the living room and hallways of the house. Walker's eyes searched for the recording device. The hard disk was at the very bottom, sticking out of the system unit. Well, what do you think? Interesting. Daniel asked quickly. He clearly didn't like the presence of a stranger in the den. Did you see it? Yes, it's cool. Madeline made a surprised face. I'm shocked. The guard smiled and offered to go to his living room for coffee or tea. Walker agreed. Thoughts were flying around chaotically in her head. What to do to get the hard drive out? We should just stay the night at his place. Daniel led Madeline to a very cozy room. There was a beautiful carved bed in the corner, a desk with a laptop near the window. The floor was decorated with a fluffy white rug. Daniel clearly liked comfort. The tea brewed by the guy was surprisingly tasty and fragrant. The guy already wanted to walk the girl out, but Madeline knew the right thing to do. She stopped Daniel with a single glance and approached him closely. The boy's pupils dilated as he touched his lips to the lips of his favorite girl. This was something to dream about. It was going to be a hot night. Walker cautiously opened her eyes. Daniel was sound asleep. Of course, you should try to stay awake after a marathon like that, she smiled. She stood up, threw the guy's shirt over her naked body, pulled a flash drive out of her pants pocket, and tiptoed out into the hallway. The TV was blaring loudly in one of the living rooms. One has to remember that besides Daniel, there are two other employees on the property. She wished she didn't have to confront them. How would she explain to them why she was walking around the security housing unit in the nude? The monitor room was open. Bingo, the room's empty, so the rest of the guards are either sleeping or wandering the grounds. There were two guards slowly strolling by the fence, so Daniel was supposed to be sitting at the monitor today. The girl didn't want the guy to get fired because of her. She'd have to act fast. Walker was good friends with the computer, so she found the database in 1 minute and put it on download. Gotta wait 5 minutes. Too long. I hope no one catches me. There was 1 more minute to go. Walker stared at the monitor. There, Vincent walked slowly down the hallway to the bedroom. Doran and Lexi were nowhere to be seen, but what was Cynthia doing in the dining room? The hostess on camera was sitting at a table surrounded by a pile of bottles and vials. She was stirring some kind of solution in a bowl. That's weird. Maybe she's making a night mask. What are you doing here? Daniel's voice sounded loud behind me. Oh no. He noticed it was missing and went to look for it. What was there to tell him if it was already obvious? Madeline slowly took out the flash drive and hid it behind her back. What's going on here? What did you download? Give me the flash drive. The guy yelled. If you come near me, I'll scream. How will you explain what I was doing here? I'm not allowed in here, Walker said calmly. Did you take advantage of me? Danielle asked. There was bitterness in his voice. How could you? I was nice to you. We had great sex. I thought we were going to see each other again. Why do you need the information from the cameras? Madeline didn't answer. To tell the truth about herself or not, the girl was starting to like Danielle. It's a shame it had to happen like this, because I'm not Obi. I'm Madeline Walker. I'm a detective. I'm trying to investigate the disappearance of someone named Catherine, Dorian's ex-girlfriend. I'm sorry about that. I didn't mean to upset you, but I won't tell anyone I was at your place and saw the surveillance system. If you don't tell anyone I'm not who I say I am, let's go to my place. Nate. Danielle took her elbow firmly. I like you so damn much. I don't even want to be mad at you. I'll tell you the whole What? The girl's eyebrows slowly crept upward. Why all the running around, the deception, when you could just ask the guy, frankly confess everything? Madeline walked into the room and sat down on the crumpled bed. Daniel stood in front of her and folded his arms in front of his chest. He was gorgeous in the moonlight, but very stern. Where did you come from? Aren't you afraid of death at all? The guard asked in surprise. I work at the Eagle Eye Detective Agency. She began. Kate's mother, Jody, came to see me 3 months ago. She was in deep mourning. Kate was Dorian's girlfriend and they had been dating for a long time. The daughter had even quarreled with her mother and moved out. Kate started living with Dorian at Smith's house. At first, everything was fine, but then Kate's sudden death from a stroke. Moreover, the girl was absolutely healthy according to her mother. There was very little information about the family on the internet, so there was nothing left but to infiltrate the house under a false name. My partner and co-owner of the agency, Brandon, helped me with the placement in this hole. Danielle listened very carefully the whole time. You're crazy. He sighed. Lucky it happened the way it did. That I found out. If the landlady finds out, you won't leave this house. Why should I? Walker was surprised. Because, He ran his hands through his hair. You're right. Katya was murdered. And it's so tricky that no pathologist will ever know why. But Kate wasn't Cynthia's only victim. Are you saying the landlady killed the girl? Madeline exclaimed. I suspected Dorian of that. He wanted to get rid of his annoying girlfriend. Bang! No. Dorian's a victim too. Of course, he's a total womanizer. I'm even a little jealous when he stares at you. Jealous, I mean. Daniel wrinkled his nose. And then what? The girl asked curiously, ignoring her boyfriend's state of mind. Let's start at the beginning. I came to work here for one reason. My mother was terminally ill. I needed expensive medicine treatment. Cynthia promised me a lot of money for my work. Of course I accepted. I quickly found a common language with the rest of the staff. I didn't know what was going on inside the mansion walls until I got to my first post. You were there a few minutes ago. Daniel frowned. Oh, and what did you see? Madeline shrieked. Don't shout like that. My staff might hear us. I saw Cynthia put something in Kate's glass. The girl didn't live a minute. It all happened in the cafeteria. The cameras recorded it. They made me erase it from the archives at the time. The police, of course, went through the hard drives, but to no avail. The Smiths promised me a large fee for my silence. Mother was getting worse, so there was nowhere to go. Kate's not the first girl. When I worked here, every time Doreen brought another pretty girl into the house, I knew she couldn't survive here. Cynthia would bite. Madeline couldn't believe her ears. How? Surely everyone knows there are murders in this mansion. The girl's parents, the servants, friends, relatives of the family, and they're all silent. But why would Cynthia do such a thing? The girls were rich, wealthy, intelligent, didn't smoke or drink alcohol. They must have dressed smartly too, because the lady of the house has been sick for a long time. The husband hides everything carefully. Sometimes, when it's really hard, he takes his wife to a boarding house. There she's treated and sent home again. After the hospital, Cynthia is unrecognizable. But some time passes and the devil comes back into her. She's jealous of her only son. The jealousy turns into schizophrenia. Oh my God, you don't say anything. Why couldn't you go and tell the police? So many innocent girls died because of your silence. Madeline was getting, well, I would have told them. And goodbye to my mother's peaceful and painless life. Haven't you ever had to sacrifice anything? Daniel asked in surprise. Madeline wondered. Whether or not one could or could not be judged for inactivity was a decision for the authorities. Time to get ready. We must tell Jane. Daniel seemed to read her thoughts. He held her tightly against him and whispered, "Yo, don't you dare. I won't let you go. You must think of other people." All the servants knew about Cynthia's antics. "Are you going to tell everyone now, you white sheep?" Madeline looked boldly into Daniel's eyes and lashed out with force. A moment more, and the guard was on the floor, pinned down tightly. I may look like a weak woman, but the urge to break free is definitely there, isn't it? Madeline said happily, sitting on the guard's back. "Don't fight it. I'm not going anywhere yet. There's no official proof, and I didn't copy the data for nothing. I won't tell anyone about you. But I need you to help me with something." "What is it?" Daniel wheezed. He tried to pull the girl off of him, but he was unsuccessful. "We have to team up and catch Cynthia doing something illegal together, or get the truth out of her." "How do you want to get the truth out of her?" "Smith is a hard nut to crack. She'll keep her mouth shut even under torture. They don't go to jail for that sort of thing. Others will go to jail for them." "Oh," Daniel grumbled as Madeline slid off him and sat down beside him. "Shall we see about that? Or are you going to be an accessory and witness to her crimes from now on? You're a good guy. Yeah, so good that you even decided to get in bed with me because of the security cameras," growled the guy. But he agreed. Despite that horrible night, Danielle was still attracted to Madeline. A satisfied Walker walked out of the security building in the early morning hours. Daniel was at his post. He gave the girl a look and sighed. All because of women in this world. Madeline, sitting in her room, pondered her next steps. One would have to be very careful. She felt that one extra step and a trap for the detective was assured. There was no need to look for an excuse to piss off the landlady. It happened the next day. Madeline was cleaning the parlor when an excited cook came into the room. "Follow me." She bellowed, her eyes round, as if she were afraid of being seen. "Where are we going?" "Peggy, what happened?" Walker whispered. "Donnie asked me to bring you. He's in the backyard. If the guard runs into the house without a good reason, the missus will get suspicious." "Come on, drop your mop." Peggy shoved the screaming girl out of the mansion. Madeline ran the rest of the way on her own. There he is, standing there, looking so handsome. The excitement made her hair stand on. "What happened? Did you tell the landlady about me?" Madeline almost choked on her feelings. Madeline clenched her hands into fists and threw herself at the guard. Daniel gripped Madeline tightly and waited for her to collapse from helplessness. "Why are you fighting at once?" "I didn't tell you anything. I just wanted to warn you that something's going to happen tomorrow. Cynthia's plotting to get rid of Lexi and her own grandson. She came to me early this morning and offered me good money for my help, and you accepted." Madeline's face glistened with tears. "I knew you were a freak, even for your own mother. I would have left my mother to die, but I wouldn't kill innocent people. I hate you." Daniel stopped her speech. "No, of course not." I agreed, but only for the sake of discovering her personality, her sick essence, together with you. That's why we have to stop her together. Madeline had an epiphany. "So that's what this is all about." The guard was very wise. "What did she tell you? What's her plan?" "I'm gonna talk fast. They might see us." Danielle looked around quickly. "Doreen doesn't know anything and can't know anything before we're done. Cynthia ordered me to go into the woods today and dig a deep hole. Clearly, she wants to bury Lexi. Get rid of her. Now listen, I've got an idea of what we're gonna do. We're gonna do it the smart way. I found a long and spacious box that Lexi can fit in. I'll make a hole in the crate and put a drain pipe in it. That way Lexi can breathe underground. The landlady will probably want to see if I buried her. Then, after 24 hours, as Lexi is buried alive, then we retrieve her. Lexi comes home to the Smiths, sees the fear in their eye. Next thing you know, it's riot police. How about that? Wow. I'm shocked." The girl whispered enthusiastically. "You could be a born detective. Are we going to tell Lexi about our—" "Yes, but later. The main thing is not to spook her. As cruel as it is, Lexi will be bait for the big fish." Cynthia, Madeline, and Daniel discussed their plans for another half an hour. Walker must carry the recorder with her at all times and not be separated from it for a minute. There was no telling when the criminal would reveal her cards. Slowly it grew dark. Madeline's heart pounded loudly in her chest. Cynthia was surprisingly cheerful and cheerful. You bet tomorrow was a holiday. New Year's Eve. Guests and friends would be coming. It's going to be fun. And the mistress will no longer worry about her unofficial daughter-in-law and grandson. Well, at least until the next time they meet. Today, Cynthia sent her husband and son out shopping for holiday gifts. What a stroke of luck. No one will have any idea what happened to Lexi. The hostess set the table herself and invited the girl to dine with her. Self to Madeline helped and retired to the kitchen on Cynthia's orders. Of course, no one must know of the crime. Peggy was trembling with fear, but Madeline reassured her. The detective knew what would happen next. The cunning hostess had slipped a strong dose of sleeping pills into the compote. Then it was all in Daniel's hands. Oh my God, I didn't know I was working for a killer. Making her food. If I'd known, I would have slipped her something, Peggy hissed. It's time to bring her to justice. Let's pray that everything goes according to plan. Madeline Walker had told Brandon everything on the phone and had outside support. If anything went wrong and the girl didn't respond within 24 hours, Brandon was to call the police. Meanwhile, Lexi was already sound asleep, dropping her head on the couch. Cynthia, satisfied with her fine work, was cleaning up the evidence of the crime from the table. Through a crack in the door, Madeline saw Daniel quietly enter the dining room. He picked Lexi up in his arms like a fluff ball and walked toward the exit. The hostess called out for Madeline to clean the dishes and mop the floors. It's dusty in here, she murmured. Oh, where did Lexi go? The housekeeper asked politely, trying not to pretend she knew. She was having dinner with you. Oh, those pregnant women are so weird. Lexi felt nauseous and went up to her room. Don't worry about her. It happens a lot to a girl in her condition, Madeline said with a sly look. Oh, I'm going upstairs after all. I'll see if she needs a doctor. Doreen called, asking how she was. Cynthia instantly turned pale. She cried out like a wounded animal. What kind of servants are they? Boorish and insolent. Honey, I told you, there's no need to bother Lexi. She's tired. Go do what you're supposed to do. Madeline, satisfied with Cynthia's reaction, silently cleaned up the dining room and hurried to the backyard where Daniel was supposed to be waiting for her. The guard was visibly nervous. Didn't anyone see you? He asked. What took you so long? I was cleaning up the dining room after dinner. Yue Walker sighed. What's the deal? Daniel nodded and they got into the car. The guard checked on Lexi, who was sleeping like a baby. Shortly before this treacherous dinner, he had told the girl what was going to happen and how to act. Lexi was in deep shock, but agreed to help, and now she was going to stay in a damp box underground for 24 hours until New Year's Eve. Don't worry, I brought a bunch of warm blankets and a winter coat. Lexi's box will be warm. Madeline snuggled into her boyfriend's strong arm. Finally, it would all be over soon, and she would be out of this damn place. The winter forest greeted them with cold and snow. Large snowdrifts lay everywhere. Madeline felt a little uneasy. She imagined that she was the one being put into a box and covered with earth. The earth was pressing on her head, her chest, the box. What thoughts? We have to chase them away. Everything will be all right. The car stopped at the cozy Peggy's. Daniel got out and stood for a minute listening to the sounds of the forest. Oh, it's nice here in the summer. He mumbled. The girl didn't think so. What if there were more graves? What if the bloodthirsty mistress had set up a graveyard of girls here? I don't even think so. I don't think so. She replied. After the owner is arrested, we should gently hint to the investigating authorities that it would be a good idea to take a walk around and look at the mounds. Do you think so? Daniel said quietly. He took Madeline's hand and squeezed it tightly in his. The girl closed her eyes affirmatively. Not far from the car, under a willow tree, was a huge black hole. A massive wooden box stood. The guard carefully took out Lexi, who was sleeping soundly, wrapped in blankets, and put the girl in the box. He also threw an old fur coat on top. Madeline helped close the lid. You had to be good with a screwdriver. I'll just put a little earth on it, so it won't squeeze through the tree. I'll put more snow on top, Daniel said in a shaky voice. He put the long flow pipe into the hole he had made in the box and breathed a sigh of relief. It was all the right size. As wisps of frozen earth fell thuddingly against the lid of the box, Madeline felt like she was attending a real funeral. Just make sure Lexi doesn't get hysterical when she wakes up. Okay, it's done. I'm gonna camouflage the pipe a little bit and take some pictures for Cynthia. Then I'll open the pipe again. That's what he did. Madeline was uneasy. All the way home, she begged that Lexi wouldn't suffocate, that it would all be over sooner. Maybe with her nerves, she shouldn't be a detective anymore. A florist or an accountant would be much better. You can sit back and not be threatened. How could she have gotten herself in such a mess? Meanwhile, Brandon, her co-worker, who must also suffer and agonize, sits at home and devours a second box of pizza with sausage or cheese. Walker's musings were interrupted by Daniel's voice. That's it. Here we go. Madeline thought for a second. Then she asked decisively, "Can I stay with you tonight? I'm too scared to stay at home." Daniel smiled, and they walked toward the security building. Paradise Corner was glowing with colorful lights. The village had been busy since morning, and the guards were working hard. Relatives and friends of the rich were coming to the village in luxury expensive cars. In the middle of the Paradise Corner, the residents themselves installed a huge live Christmas tree, a joy for the next 2 or 3 weeks for the children of the Majors. The tree was decorated with colorful lanterns and big balls. The smell of goodies and kebabs wafted everywhere. The male part of the population traditionally roasted meat for New Year's tables. Only the Smith mansion did not light its holiday lights this morning. The house was in a frenzy. Dorian was throwing plates hysterically, Cynthia screaming pleadingly for him to stop. The servants gathered in the dining room and watched as the Smith son shamelessly destroyed the holiday sets. "Where's Lexi, you monster?" he yelled at his mother. "How many times have I told you to stop meddling in my life?" Another plate flew into the wall. Peggy groaned and sat down. She didn't really want to get hit in the forehead with the next piece of dishware. Madeline woke up on New Year's Eve morning in Daniel's arms. A strong wind was blowing through the window, small snowflakes flying. Here comes the last day in this hellish place. Then freedom, thought the girl. She kissed the sleeping guy and quickly got ready. I wonder what's in the Smith mansion. Doreen Madeline arrived at the house. She saw a stunning scene. Doreen packing his suitcase, Cynthia running from corner to corner with her hands clasped together, Vincent sitting in a chair, his face expressionless. Peggy was crying in a corner. Muse Scott was running after the landlady with valerian and ammonia. Fine, now we have to wait until evening, Walker thought. She could hear Muse Scott calling the guests and politely telling each one that the hostess was ill and the party at their house was canceled. Too bad. There would have been plenty of witnesses to Lexi's mysterious resurrection. Poor thing. Madeline found Daniel in the barn. "It's time," he said. "Wait, I'll get the car out and get a shovel. I'll get a thermos too. Poor thing's freezing. I'll get the tea." Madeline shouted and ran into the kitchen. Peggy was there. She was sobbing and huddled on the table. When the girl came into the room, the cook came up. "Cynthia knows all about your plans. She is looking all over the house for you. Run, my girl." Madeline turned around and wanted to open the door, but she was beaten to it. A strong and hard hand grabbed the girl by the scruff of the neck. It was Cynthia. She let out a victorious yell and dragged Walker upstairs. No, Madeline has to go after Lexi now. At least Peggy had warned Daniel. Let him go on his own, get the girl. While she distracts the old git, Cynthia shut the door noisily behind her and groaned in triumph. "Oh, I know all about you, bitch. Who you are and why you came here. I'm not letting you out of here alive." Madeline remembered that she still had her tape recorder in her pants pocket. She decided not to waste any more time. "Oh, come on. You're the one who hired me," Walker said wryly. The only thought in her head was, what a bunch of Adamses. Disgusting. If I'd seen what could happen in that rich, old mansion earlier, I would never have worked there. Cynthia frantically searched the nightstand for her pills. She cursed irritably every time she failed to find the vial in the next locker. Abandoning her futile efforts, the woman walked over to the safe, opened the code lock, and pulled out a gun. If I had known who you were, I would have shot you in the agency." She hysterical, and believe me, I wouldn't have gotten anything for it. I'd have given money to the management, and they would have kept their mouths shut. "What did you find out, you bitch?" "Just what I needed," Madeline replied and laughed. Tell me, how did you manage to cover up the mass murder of all the Doran girls? And more importantly, why did you do it?" Cynthia quieted down and asked in a whisper, sitting down on the bank. How did you find out about it?" "I didn't tell anyone. Even my husband sometimes didn't know how I had to hide the corpses." "So it was you who killed them?" "Well, not always. Kate did. I just overdid it with the poison." But the pathologist didn't even think to send the blood for poison testing. The rest of them were helped by drivers and guards, and with Lexi. Madeline said slowly, "May, did you give her sleeping pills and bury her alive?" "Well, I was fine with Lexi at first. I thought Doreen would play with her and toss her aside like a toy. But he didn't. He got her pregnant. It was immediately clear that it had to end." Cynthia sighed noisily and scratched her temple with her pistol. "Why are you asking me all this? You're not going to live anyway. You think you can sneak out of my house? The guards have served me well for a long time, so don't get your hopes up." Madeline decided to ask another question. "Why? Why did you do all this? Isn't it nice for a mother to know that her son is a happy family man?" "Doreen tried to find his soulmate every time, but you wouldn't let him." "I grew up in a rich family," Cynthia began. "I had no siblings. My parents spoiled me all the time. I was used to having everything handed to me as a child. When I met Vidley, I realized that he would be mine too, forever. Doreen, though he grew up alone without brothers and sisters, didn't grow up like me. My son was the life of the party. He liked to give and share. Basically, he did all the things that pissed me off, and I was jealous of all those girls who wanted to take my son away from me. Yeah, I got rid of them hard, but I love my Doreen. Love can explain everything, but it's a sick love," Madeline sneered. "You're sick. You need to stay in the clinic under lock and key. How many victims have died at your hands? Somewhere over 10 beauties. But I don't regret it one bit. They will only bring disappointment to me." "What about Lexi?" "She carried your grandson. Lexi was a good girl, but she didn't know how to treat my Doran well. They were always fighting." "Okay, we've talked enough. Don't worry, you won't suffer." Cynthia was about to point the gun at the frightened girl, but there was a noise and the sound of breaking glass downstairs. Another minute, and people rushed into the mistress' bedroom. Danielle, a pale Lexi, Doreen, and many more. Magie was among them. She cried, "Madeline, are you okay?" A guard rushed to the girl. Madeline was trembling, whether from fear or Lexi. The owner exclaimed, losing her mind, "How did you get here? You're dead." The girl smiled sadly. "Yes, I was supposed to be buried asleep." "How cruel you have to be to get rid of yourself that way." Doreen went out into the corridor and shouted to someone, "You can take it." "It's all right." An assault team flew into the bedroom in full armor. They threw Cynthia to the floor. The woman did not resist. She only moaned and hurled angry curses. The investigation to solve the series of murders stretched on for a long time. Evil mistress of an ancient mansion killed more than one innocent girl, each one with particular cruelty. Vincent Taylor and Doreen Smith were also charged with covering up the crime and helping to facilitate the atrocity. Madeline was able to return home. The first thing she did was to call Jean. "Good afternoon. This is Madeline Walker. I can now tell you that your case has been reopened. Kate did die, not die of natural causes. I will give you the address of the investigation team that is currently looking into this." Jody was grateful for the young detective's work. She even advised her acquaintances to contact Madeline Walker if suddenly need to solve an important and mysterious case. The entire staff of the mansion was fired and taken for long interrogations. Lexi had returned to her parents and was now enjoying her pregnancy. Never mind Doreen. Cynthia was placed in a mental institution where she was nursed back to health after the forest, at Madeline's request, had been completely checked and something terrible had been found there. In the thickest part of the forest, where it is difficult to pass without sticks or an axe, there were many bumps resembling graves. When the investigator, together with his team, exhumed the remains of the bodies, he confirmed that they were Doran's ex-girlfriends. Monica's daughter was among them. When the former washerwoman found out, she went to hospital with a heart attack. She could not calmly endure the fact that her favorite mistress ruthlessly massacred the only child of the servants. Also, traces of potent poisons were found in Cynthia's bedroom. The vials themselves were nowhere to be found. Apparently, the cunning landlady had hidden them or disposed of the evidence. Madeline and Daniel continued to date. The boy got a job at Madeline's agency and now helped the girl with everything. Brandon, when he found out that Madeline had found a lover, was not very much upset. At that time, he had already found a beautiful person from the kind of intellectuals and spent a lot of time in her company. Madeline Walker first time just lay in bed and enjoyed the tranquility. At last one could lie down and not have to clean anything. The girl was much interested in the details of the development of the case. How good that grief-stricken relatives were able to bury their children and calm down. After all, some had hoped for years that their daughters were missing. Madeline learns that Peggy, the cook at the mansion, has taken a job at the local bakery as a baker and is even successfully improving her bread baking skills. Brandon and Mila, Daniel, and Madeline sat in a cozy cafe at the intersection of the main streets. Walker loved this place. She'd often eaten the mouth-watering buns and croissants here before, but now she just enjoyed the good company. "Walker, you're the talk of the Paradise Corner." Brandon exclaimed happily, and all over the news. "You're a local celebrity now. You get the best-looking coffee cup. Oh, it doesn't matter what cup you drink from, as long as it tastes good," she said. Brandon laughed merrily. "When's the wedding, lovebirds?" He asked Daniel. He thought about it and said, "Why don't you ask Madeline? I keep calling her, but nothing. The fish aren't biting." Madeline didn't say anything. She knew that Daniel had received a letter from the police calling him in for questioning as a defendant. The thought that her boyfriend could be sentenced to prison made it hard to make any further plans for his life. Daniel realized it himself, so he didn't stress the girl with his desire to create a family. "It'll be okay," he said with a look at Madeline, and she winked. When the investigation into Daniel's involvement in the abuse and murder of girls began, the prosecution got its way. The guy was facing 2 years in a maximum security penal colony. Madeline agreed to wait for him and not meet anyone. It was a cold winter day. All the holidays had passed Madeline by, so she decided to catch up and have a small New Year's Eve party at home. When the girl finished, she was satisfied with her work. A small Christmas tree stood in the corner, decorated with homemade toys. Madeline, living alone, did not celebrate holidays at home. A couple of salads, tangerines, and a bottle of champagne were on the table. Madeline took another look around the room and was pleased with herself. "Oh, what a hostess I am," she said to herself. The doorbell rang. There she was, standing there, red with frost, holding a box with a red bow. "Maggie." The girl rushed to hug her friend. The former cook had become close friends with Walker, and Madeline often invited her for walks and visits. Now Peggy came into the house and filled it with her laughter, her lively smile, and her joy. "Do you think Daniel will come back as he was before the colony?" Madeline asked Peggy. She was silent for a moment, finished her salad, and answered, "You know, everything in life is fair. A lot of people have relatives die, but that doesn't give a man absolutely no right to take the lives of others. In fact, Daniel, like Cynthia, is a killer. It's good for him to realize that, and also that when he gets out of prison, he remembers what he did and doesn't repeat his mistakes." Madeline sighed and drank her glass of champagne in a gulp. She wished that all the people in whom anger and hatred lived would one day realize that it was possible to live differently and appreciate every minute. The snow fell and fell. The friends were laughing loudly. Next year promised to be even more